Section 1. The World That Needed It. There is something deeply comforting about the late 1990s, something that wraps around you like a blanket that has been in the dryer a little too long, just warm enough, just a little worn in, and familiar in that specific way that makes you exhale slowly without even meaning to. The televisions were bigger and heavier, sitting on wooden stands in living rooms carpeted with thick rugs that nobody would choose today. The remote controls had too many buttons. The picture was softer than anything you watch now, not in a broken way, but in a gentle way, like the world had a lower resolution that was somehow easier on the eyes. Sunday nights in American homes smelled like whatever dinner was still lingering from a few hours earlier, and the sound from the living room was the sound of whatever Fox was putting on that night. It was in that world, in those living rooms, during those slow, quiet evenings, that something entirely new was about to arrive. Something loud and strange and ridiculous and sometimes genuinely tender all at once. Something that almost did not exist at all, built from nothing more than one young man's obsession with cartoons and a student film made on equipment that barely worked, pitched to a television network by a 24-year-old who had no business being in that meeting room and walked out of it having changed the history of American animation. To understand how Family Guy came to exist, you have to understand the world it was born into. And that world, as it turns out, was the perfect soil for something like this to grow. By the late 1990s, animated comedies aimed at adults had established themselves as a legitimate and commercially powerful genre of television. The Simpsons had premiered back in 1989 and had spent most of the following decade demonstrating that an animated show could be smart, satirical, widely watched, and taken seriously as art. South Park launched in 1997 on Comedy Central and immediately showed that animated comedy could go further and darker and more confrontational than even The Simpsons was willing to venture. King of the Hill premiered on Fox in 1997 as well, taking a completely different approach, slower, warmer, more grounded, finding its comedy not in absurdity but in the quiet dignity of ordinary life in Texas. These three shows had proven, separately, that the audience for adult animation was enormous and hungry and not going anywhere. But all three of those shows had something in common that their creators may or may not have noticed. They were all, at their core, built around consistent internal logic. The Simpsons was anarchic, but it operated within Springfield's established rules. South Park was outrageous, but it built each episode around a coherent argument, however twisted. King of the Hill was deliberately realistic. Each of these shows had a recognizable grammar to how they worked. What nobody had quite done yet, at least not on the scale of network primetime television, was build an animated comedy around a completely different kind of storytelling rhythm. Something that would interrupt itself at will. Something that would chase its own tangents and then snap back. Something that would feel less like a story being told and more like a brilliantly funny person just talking to you, drifting into whatever random corner of their brain happened to light up next. That was the gap, and without knowing exactly what they were looking for, that was what Fox was searching for when they sat down to look at what a 24-year-old from Connecticut had made in his spare time. The late 1990s also had another quality that made this moment possible. The internet existed, but it was not yet the dominant force in entertainment. YouTube was still years away. Streaming services were a concept that lived only in science fiction. If you wanted to watch something, you watched it when it was on. That meant that any show that captured a particular feeling, that late-night, slightly irreverent, comfortable but edgy feeling, had a captive audience that would show up reliably every week just to feel that feeling again. The relationship between a television show and its audience was more intimate then, more dependent on mutual loyalty, because there was no other way to find each other, and the humor of the late 1990s itself was in a particular place. The culture was not yet exhausted by irony. The cynicism that would mark the 2000s and deepen into something bleaker in the 2010s was still mostly kept at a comedic distance. People were willing to laugh at things in a way that was slightly more uncomplicated. The economy was good. The country was not at war. The specific weight of 21st century American life had not yet landed. There was an openness, an availability to be genuinely entertained without requiring art to justify its own existence before the credits rolled. Adult animation, in 1999, still carried a mild whiff of novelty. Your grandparents might raise an eyebrow if you told them you were watching a cartoon. Your parents might give you a look. The form itself still felt a little bit daring just by existing in primetime, and a show that leaned into that wore its cartoon identity proudly, while also being unambiguously written for adults, would find an audience that was ready to feel like they were getting away with something just by tuning in. That was the world. Warm living rooms, heavy televisions, a late 1990s cultural comfort that nobody fully appreciated until it was gone, and a network that was looking for the next animated hit on Sunday nights. All of this was the kindling. What was needed was someone willing to strike a match. That person was sitting in Kent, Connecticut, drawing cartoons before he could reliably read, and he had been getting ready for this moment his entire life. If you made it this far, drop a comment down below and tell me where you are in the world right now and what time it is. I genuinely love knowing who's watching. And if you want to follow along on this journey and be here for every story we tell, hit subscribe. It's completely free and it means a lot. Section 2. A Boy from Kent, Connecticut. Kent, Connecticut is the kind of small town that shows up in the pages of American fiction as a kind of shorthand for a certain flavor of New England life. It sits in Litchfield County, tucked into the northwestern corner of the state, the land rolling gently with hills that hold their color through October and then go bare in November in that specific way that makes the air smell like wood smoke and cold earth. It is not a large place. It never has been. The population hovers somewhere around a few thousand people depending on who is counting and when. There is the school Kent School, the prestigious boarding institution that has been educating children from families of means since 1906. And there are the houses. And there is the quiet. And there are the seasons changing the way seasons change in small New England towns, reliably, slowly, like a clock that has been running for a very long time. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born in this town on the 26th of October, 1973. His father, Ronald, was a teacher. His mother, Anne, worked in academic administration. His sister, Rachel, who would later become a voice actress and singer herself, was also part of this household. It was, by all visible accounts, a perfectly ordinary American upbringing in a beautiful, quiet corner of New England, except that from almost the very beginning, Seth MacFarlane was clearly not operating on a standard frequency. He started drawing cartoon characters at the age of 2, not scribbling in the vague direction of shapes, but actually drawing recognizable cartoon characters. Fred Flintstone, Woody Woodpecker, the images that were saturating the television screens of the era, soaking into the mind of a child who was watching with the kind of focused attention that adults usually do not notice in very young children. By the time he could talk in full sentences, he was already asking the question that would define his entire life. How are cartoons made? His curiosity was not casual. It had the quality of a hunger, a need to understand not just what he was watching, but how it existed, what the mechanism was, who had made it, and how they had gotten it onto the screen. At 8 years old, he got his first paying job. He began publishing his own comic strip in the local Kent newspaper. The strip was called Walter Crouton, and the paper paid him $5 per week to produce it. Think about that for a moment. An 8-year-old child publishing a newspaper comic strip, earning money for it. Most 8-year-olds are still figuring out how multiplication works. Seth MacFarlane was already in the media business, already working within a professional context, already producing content on a deadline for an audience. The discipline and the confidence and the self-seriousness required for a child to sit down every week and produce something good enough to put in front of the public that is not a normal thing. That is the earliest possible signal that something unusual is happening inside this particular person. At 11, he entered a cartoon contest at the Museum of Cartoon Art and finished third. He was already placing competitively against adults in a professional context. His artistic influences were coalescing around a particular combination of sensibilities: Gary Larson's deadpan absurdity in The Far Side, Matt Groening's anarchic warmth in early Life in Hell comics, and the physical comedy and timing of classic Looney Tunes. These were not just things he enjoyed, they were things he studied. He watched the way a joke was constructed. He thought about why certain timing worked and other timing did not. He was learning craft before he had any formal training in it. The pivotal moment came when Seth MacFarlane was 14 years old. He sat down one evening and watched his very first episode of The Simpsons. This was 1987 or 1988 during the Tracy Ullman Show era, when The Simpsons appeared as short animated bumpers rather than their own series. What he saw lit something up in him that had not been quite switched on before. The Simpsons did something that no animated show had done before. It proved that animation could be genuinely smart, that it could have real writing underneath it, that the cartoon form was not inherently limited to children, that it could be used to say something about the world, about families, about the particular absurdity of American life. Watching The Simpsons, Seth MacFarlane understood for the first time what he was going to spend his life doing. Not just drawing, not just animating, making shows, making something that could sit in the same conversation as the things he admired most. He graduated from Kent School in 1991 and enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence. Known informally as RISD, pronounced RISD, it is considered one of the top art schools in the United States, a place where people who are serious about visual art go to get serious in a structured way. MacFarlane arrived there to study animation, and for the first time in his life he was surrounded by other people who were as focused and as driven about this particular pursuit as he was. The academic environment of RISD in the early 1990s was rigorous and creatively demanding, and MacFarlane threw himself into it the way people do when they find themselves exactly where they are supposed to be. He practiced voices constantly during these years, not just drawing, not just animating, but voices constructing characters from the inside out through their sound. He had grown up watching voice actors work without ever quite putting together what they were doing, and now at RISD he began to understand it as a craft, began to experiment with the idea that a character could be built first through the way it spoke. His ear was extraordinary. He could hear a voice, understand its structure, and reproduce it with remarkable accuracy. He could also invent voices, could find the sound of a character that did not yet exist, could hold that sound in his throat and build a personality around it. He was also singing seriously during this period. Music was always a second, parallel passion running alongside his love of animation, and at RISD he trained his voice in a way that would eventually lead him to the stages of Carnegie Hall and the Royal Albert Hall, though none of that was visible yet. He had considered, briefly, enrolling at the Boston Conservatory of Music to study musical theater. He chose RISD instead, which turned out to be the decision that everything else hinged on. His comedy influences were assembling themselves into a specific education during these years. Woody Allen, Mel Brooks, Monty Python. The anarchic, intelligent, sometimes deeply uncomfortable humor of the Zucker-Abrahams films, All in the Family. The sitcoms of the 1980s that he had absorbed growing up. He loved music from a completely different era than his own. The big band sound, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Bing Crosby, the golden age of American popular music that had ended decades before he was born, but which he absorbed as though he had lived through it. This combination of an old soul aesthetic in music and a very modern, sharp, boundary-pushing sensibility in comedy would eventually give Family Guy much of its particular texture, that quality of being simultaneously nostalgic and transgressive, loving and shocking, old-fashioned and completely of its moment. 2 weeks before he was supposed to graduate from RISD, something happened that changed the trajectory of his entire life. His professor at RISD, without telling him, had submitted his student film to Hanna-Barbera Productions, the legendary animation studio that had given the world the Flintstones, Scooby-Doo, Yogi Bear, and dozens of other animated institutions. Hanna-Barbera had seen the film. Hanna-Barbera was interested, and before Seth MacFarlane had even received his diploma, he had a job offer from one of the most storied animation studios in American history. To understand how significant this was, you have to understand what it meant to get a job at Hanna-Barbera in 1995. Animation jobs were not easy to come by. The industry was competitive and relatively closed, with most opportunities going to people who had spent years building relationships and working their way through lower-level positions. MacFarlane got a job from a phone call that his professor made on his behalf, based on a student film, 2 weeks before graduation. He was 21 years old. He packed up his life in Providence and moved to Los Angeles, and his education, at least the formal portion of it, was over. The real education was about to begin. The student film that launched all of this was called The Life of Larry, 11 minutes long, hand-animated, made in his dorm room at RISD with equipment that cost almost nothing. It told the story of a hapless, overweight, not very bright man named Larry and his dog Steve, who could talk. The animation was rough. The budget was essentially zero. But the voice work was already there, the humor was already there, The DNA of something that would eventually reach hundreds of millions of people was already visible. In this student film made in a college dorm room by a college 21-year-old who just wanted to make people laugh. Larry and Steve. Those two characters, that hapless man and his intelligent talking dog. Whatever you might currently know about a blue-collar man from Rhode Island named Peter and his dog Brian, who can walk upright and drink martinis and has opinions about literature, you are looking at the same two people. The life of Larry was the Big Bang of Family Guy, the single original moment from which everything else in this story expands. It just took a few more years, a few more intermediate steps, one more short film, and a meeting with some people from Fox before it all went fully supernova. Section 3. Rhode Island, RISD, and the making of something real. Let's slow down and spend some proper time with what Seth MacFarlane actually built at RISD, because it deserves that attention. The life of Larry is one of those artifacts that people have gone back and watched after the fact, trying to find the moment where Family Guy began, and what they find is both simpler and more instructive than they expected. The film opens in the way that student films from the mid-1990s tended to open, a little rough, a little self-conscious, the way everything looks when someone is still learning the grammar of the form. But very quickly, something comes through that overrides the technical roughness. The voice work is already strong. Larry, the central character, is immediately recognizable as a type, the American everyman slob, the good-natured idiot, the person who is somehow lovable, despite making bad decisions at nearly every available opportunity. Steve the dog, speaking with a flat, dry intelligence that contrasted perfectly with his owner's cheerful obliviousness, had a quality that went beyond the typical cartoon animal. He seemed like a real character, not a device. The thing MacFarlane understood, even at this stage, was that the comedy between Larry and Steve worked because of contrast. Larry was all noise and impulse. Steve was all observation and restraint. Together they created something that neither of them could create alone, a back and forth that had a musical quality to it, like two instruments that sound better in conversation than they do playing separately. That relationship would eventually become the backbone of Family Guy, transferred into Peter and Brian, and while the names changed, and the context changed, and the world around them grew enormously more complex, the fundamental dynamic never really changed. The loud fool and the intelligent witness. The person causing the chaos and the person watching it with something between fondness and horror. MacFarlane has talked about the experience of making the life of Larry in the way that creative people sometimes talk about their early work, with a mixture of fondness and self-deprecation that is actually a disguised form of deep pride. He described the difference between the life of Larry and Family Guy by saying that the Larry film was made primarily in his dorm room and watched primarily by his dorm mates. This is the kind of offhanded remark that sounds humble, but contains within it the entire arc of what happened next. The recognition that what had been a private, personal thing was about to become something that lived in the world. After graduation, after moving to Los Angeles, after starting his work at Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane made a second short film. This one was called Larry and Steve, and it was made for Fred Seibert's What a Cartoon! Showcase on Cartoon Network, a program specifically designed to give animators a platform to test short-form ideas in front of an audience. Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon! Was essentially a laboratory for animated concepts, and it had an impressive track record. Dexter's Laboratory, Johnny Bravo, and Cow and Chicken all began as What a Cartoon! Shorts before becoming full series. The program was exactly the right context for what MacFarlane was doing. Larry and Steve expanded on the template of the life of Larry. The animation was more polished, the jokes were sharper, the relationship between the two characters had developed in the time that had passed. Steve the dog was now clearly the brains of the partnership, operating with a frustrated intelligence that was both funny and strangely sympathetic. Larry remained the lovable catastrophe he had always been. The short was successful enough to air on Cartoon Network, which meant it reached a national audience for the first time. It was this short, Larry and Steve, that caught the attention of executives at Fox. The story of exactly how they saw it varies depending on who is telling it, but the essential fact is that people at Fox Broadcasting watched this short film and responded to it. They saw something in the Larry and Steve dynamic that felt like the seed of something bigger. They reached out to MacFarlane and asked him if he wanted to develop the concept into a television series. He said yes. Of course he said yes. He had been building toward this moment since he was 2 years old, drawing Fred Flintstone on whatever surface was available. The question was, what would the series actually be? The answer McFarlane arrived at was not simply Larry and Steve with more episodes. The development process involved significant changes to both the concept and the characters. Larry and Steve were a duo, but they needed a world around them. They needed a family. They needed a community. They needed a context that would allow the show to tell stories of varying emotional weight, stories about relationships and ambition and failure and loyalty, and the particular comedy of domestic life, all the things that the greatest animated comedies had mined so productively before. So Larry became Peter. The name changed, the setting changed, and crucially, Peter was given a family that Larry had never had, a wife named Lois, 3 children, Meg, Chris, and baby Stewie. And Steve the dog became Brian, kept largely intact from his original incarnation but now embedded in a richer family dynamic. No longer just the dog of an oblivious bachelor, but the dog of an entire household, each member of which offered different comedic possibilities. The town was set in Rhode Island, which felt right for a number of reasons. McFarlane had spent 4 years at RISD and had absorbed the particular texture of small-city New England life. Rhode Island had a blue-collar, working-class quality to it, especially in its mid-sized cities, that was perfect for the show McFarlane was building. It was not the glamour of New York or Los Angeles. It was not the flat Midwestern friendliness of Springfield, Illinois. It was a specific, regional, slightly weathered New England sensibility Patriots fans and brewery workers, and the kind of people who call a drink, and a sandwich a sub, and have lived in the same neighborhood for decades without any particular desire to live somewhere else. That felt like the right world for Peter and Lois Griffin. The creative work of building the show at this stage was essentially happening in McFarlane's apartment, in much the same spirit that The Life of Larry had been built in his dorm room. The scale was entirely different. This was not a student film. This was a pitch for a television network, but the fundamental creative process was the same one that had always driven him. Think of the funniest possible thing. Build the characters from the inside out. Make sure every voice felt distinct and alive. Trust the contrast. Fox gave him $50,000 to create the pilot. For context, the average budget for a half-hour animated pilot at that time was approximately $1 million. $50,000 was a genuinely absurd number for this purpose. McFarlane did the only thing he could do with that constraint. He animated most of it himself. He spent 6 months working out of his apartment, drawing and coloring and timing and recording, producing a 15-minute presentation that would go before Fox's executive team and determine whether any of this would ever reach a television screen. The pitch pilot that resulted was rough in the way that anything produced for $50,000 is rough. But the ideas inside it were already clear. The voices were already fully formed. Peter was exactly who he would always be. Brian was exactly who he would always be. Stewie, who appeared in this pilot in an early form, was already pointing towards something completely original. The skeleton of the show was there, and the people who watched it at Fox could see it. What they could not have fully seen, what nobody in that room could have known, was that the character of Stewie Griffin, in particular, was going to become one of the most beloved and quoted and recognizable characters in the history of American animation. He was there in that pilot, already speaking in that refined British cadence, already plotting in ways that made no sense for a year-old child and perfect sense for the villain McFarlane was building. But his full power was still locked inside that early animation, waiting for a larger stage. The Fox executives who sat down to watch this pitch were Gary Newman and Dana Walden, who headed 20th Century Fox Television. They were impressed, not just mildly pleased, not simply willing to take a chance. They were genuinely excited about what they saw. They commissioned 13 episodes and gave McFarlane the green light to build the show for real. The deal was signed in May of 1998. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old. He was now the youngest showrunner in the history of network television. Section 4. Hanna-Barbera and the Years Between. Before we follow the story all the way to that Fox commissioning meeting, there is a period of time that deserves its own attention, the years Seth MacFarlane spent working at Hanna-Barbera after graduation from RISD, before Family Guy was a real thing, while he was still a young animator learning the professional side of the craft. Hanna-Barbera in the mid-1990s was a different kind of institution than it had been in its golden era. The studio that had pioneered primetime animation with the Flintstones in 1960 and populated Saturday morning television with dozens of beloved characters through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s was now part of the Turner Broadcasting empire, operating as what would eventually become Cartoon Network Studios. The company had tremendous history and institutional knowledge, even if its current output felt, to some observers, a little less vital than it had been during its heyday. For McFarlane, working there was an education in every dimension of professional animation. He was hired as a writer and animator, and in that capacity he worked on several shows that were part of the Cartoon Network lineup. He worked on Dexter's Laboratory, the show about a boy genius with a secret laboratory hidden behind a bookcase, created by Genndy Tartakovsky, which was one of the most genuinely creative animated shows of the era. He worked on Johnny Bravo, the show about a muscle-bound, self-obsessed young man with a pompadour who was constantly failing to charm women, a show whose comedy lived in the gap between Johnny's self-image and reality. He worked on Cow and Chicken, the surreal, absurdist comedy about a cow and a chicken who were, improbably, siblings. He did freelance work for Walt Disney Animation and for Nelvana. He also worked, briefly, on Jungle Cubs, the Disney show that depicted the young versions of the Jungle Book characters. Each of these shows taught him something different. Dexter's Laboratory showed him how to build comedy around intelligence, around a character whose genius was both his greatest asset and the source of all his problems. Johnny Bravo showed him how to build comedy around a character who was oblivious to their own limitations, someone whose confidence was entirely disproportionate to their actual capabilities. This would inform Peter Griffin enormously. Cow and Chicken showed him how far you could push absurdity before it stopped being funny and became alienating, a lesson that would matter enormously when he was calibrating the tone of a show whose central premise included a talking dog and a genocidal infant. He was also, during these years, developing his voice acting skills in a professional context. Working in animation means being in and around voice recording, means hearing how professional voice actors approach characters, means developing an intuition for what a voice needs to do to make a character feel alive on screen. McFarlane was already exceptional at this, but the professional context sharpened and disciplined what had been raw talent into something more reliable and more versatile. He was also, importantly, absorbing the business side of animation. How a show's production worked from a logistical standpoint, how writing rooms operated, how the relationship between a creator and a network functioned. He was watching all of this from the inside, not as a showrunner yet, but as someone who was paying close enough attention to understand the architecture of how a show actually got made. The cultural context of animation in the mid-1990s was itself interesting. Pixar had just released Toy Story in November of 1995, which had permanently altered the landscape of theatrical animation and set the stage for the digital revolution in the form. But television animation was still largely hand-drawn, still operating on tight budgets and tight schedules, still organized around the rhythms of traditional production. The shows McFarlane worked on were all hand-animated in the classical sense, and this grounded him in the technical reality of how this art form worked, what its possibilities and limitations were, what kinds of storytelling choices suited the medium. Meanwhile, the Larry and Steve short had aired on Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon showcase and had registered its quiet success. McFarlane had made it as a kind of creative proof of concept for himself as much as anything else, a way of demonstrating what the Larry character could do in a slightly more polished context. And it had worked. The short was funny. The relationship between the two characters felt alive. Something about it lingered. It was somewhere in this period, between producing the Larry and Steve short and beginning serious discussions with Fox, that McFarlane made the creative decision that would matter most for what Family Guy eventually became. He decided that Larry was not the main character of the show he was building, or rather, he decided that Larry alone was not enough. What the show needed was a family around him. What it needed was the comedic richness of a domestic world, a wife who was smarter and more capable and more patient than she had any reason to be, children who each represented a different frequency of adolescent confusion and aspiration, a household with enough characters inside it to generate stories in dozens of different directions. The talking dog stayed Steve became Brian, and Brian remained essentially what Steve had been, the one genuinely intelligent presence in a household that sometimes made intelligence feel like a curse. The wit and the dry observation and the failed literary ambitions and the slightly too much drinking, all of that came directly from Steve, evolved through the time MacFarlane had spent thinking about what this character needed to be. Stewie was something genuinely new. There was no precursor for Stewie in the Larry shorts. Stewie emerged from a specific, imaginative question that MacFarlane asked himself: what would it look like if a baby was not helpless? What would it look like if the most physically powerless member of a household was also the most intellectually formidable? What if the creature in the high chair, who everyone cooed over and ignored, was actually plotting something? The contrast between a baby's appearance and a supervillain's interior life was so absolute that MacFarlane immediately recognized it as a wellspring of potentially limitless comedy. For the voice of Stewie, MacFarlane drew on Rex Harrison's performance in My Fair Lady, the 1964 musical film in which Harrison played the famously insufferable Professor Henry Higgins. Harrison's diction in that film was clipped and precise and carried a particular quality of controlled condescension, a voice that sounded like it had never made an informal sound in its entire life. MacFarlane took that quality and ran it through the additional filter of a Bond villain archetype: the cold, composed intelligence, the unhurried certainty, the sense of a person who has considered every possible eventuality and is simply waiting for events to catch up with their planning. Put that voice in the body of a 1-year-old in a yellow shirt, sitting in a high chair eating strained peas, and you have something that makes almost no sense and is somehow perfect. He also added, at some point during this development period, one more quality that would prove essential to Stewie in those first 3 seasons: genuine menace. Stewie was not just funny, he was frightening. The plans he made were real plans. The weapons he built were real weapons, at least within the logic of the show. His obsession with killing his mother, Lois, was not a joke that was immediately deflated. It was a running reality of the show, and it created a consistent undertone of real danger beneath the silliness. A baby who was actually plotting to kill someone. A year-old child who had built a laser cannon in his bedroom. The comedy worked precisely because the menace was always real, always present, always one step below the surface. The Griffin family, by the time MacFarlane sat down to pitch it formally to Fox in May of 1998, was fully formed. Peter and Brian were there from the beginning, descended directly from Larry and Steve. Stewie was new, entirely original, already one of the most inventive character concepts in animated television. Lois was there, smart and warm and burdened with the knowledge of what she had married. Meg was there, the ordinary one in an extraordinary family. Chris was there, good-natured and slow, a gentler version of his father. The neighbors were beginning to take shape. The town of a fictional Rhode Island community. The bars and the brewery and the high school and the houses that were all slightly too close together was all there. The show had a world. It had characters. It had a voice. It had a rhythm. Now it just needed someone to say yes. Section 5. The Pitch That Changed Television. May 1998. A conference room somewhere on a Fox lot in Los Angeles. Seth MacFarlane, 24 years old, walks in with 15 minutes of hand-animated footage and a voice that can shift from a blue-collar Rhode Islander to a British supervillain baby to a dry, slightly drunk dog and back again, seemingly without effort. The executives who sat across from him that day, Gary Newman and Dana Walden, who ran 20th Century Fox Television, had heard a lot of pitches. Television development involves an enormous number of pitches. Most of them are forgettable. Some of them are politely declined. Occasionally, one of them is something else entirely, something that makes the room feel different, something that changes the register of the meeting from professional assessment to something closer to genuine excitement. This was one of those meetings. What they watched in that room was a 15-minute pilot demo that Seth MacFarlane had produced almost entirely by himself over a period of approximately 6 months in his apartment for a budget of $50,000. The demo was rough. The animation was not by any standard of professional television production, something that would air as is. The character designs were still evolving. The movements were stiff in places. The color work was not quite what it would eventually become. None of that mattered. What mattered was the voices. What mattered was the timing. What mattered was that in 15 minutes of rough animation, McFarlane had established 5 fully distinct, fully alive characters who were already funny, already surprising, and already suggesting that they could sustain an entire television series. Peter's voice had the quality McFarlane had been developing since his days at RISD, modeled on a loudmouth security guard he had encountered at college, someone with a thick Rhode Island accent and absolutely no internal filter between thinking something and saying it. Lois's voice, which had been developed with Alex Borstein, who had just come off a stint on the sketch comedy show Mad TV, had a warmth and a weariness to it that immediately suggested a real human relationship. Stewie's voice was already fully formed, that precise, clipped, terrifyingly composed British cadence that made you laugh and feel slightly uneasy at the same time. And Brian's voice was McFarlane performing a version of himself, or at least a version of the person he aspired to be: cultured, literate, slightly world-weary, operating with grace in a world that constantly failed to meet his standards. Brian spoke the way a person who has read a great many books and drunk slightly too many martinis speaks, with a precision that was always on the verge of becoming pompous but somehow always pulled back just in time. The executive said yes. They commissioned 13 episodes, and the real work began. The writer's room that McFarlane assembled for Family Guy was small and tightly focused. The original team included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. This group would share a single office for the first several months of production space that had been loaned to them by the King of the Hill production crew, which tells you something about how small and scrappy this whole operation was at the beginning. They were working in borrowed rooms on a show that had been made possible by a $50,000 pilot, trying to build something that could survive the scrutiny of a national audience. The early writing process was collaborative in the specific way that animation writing rooms tend to be. One writer would take a story and produce a first draft. The draft would go around the room and every writer would contribute. The jokes would be refined, replaced, made sharper, or stranger, or both. The cutaway gags, those brief, tangential scenes that interrupted the main story for a joke and then returned to it, were developed in what the writers called gag rooms. Small groups of writers who would go off to a separate space and pitch dozens of possible cutaways for a particular setup, bringing back the best ones to the main room for evaluation. This process created a democratic quality to the humor, a variety of sensibilities all filtered through McFarlane's final judgment about what worked and what did not. McFarlane himself was deeply involved in every aspect of the production during this period. He was not just the creator and the voice actor. He was the showrunner, which, at age 24, made him, as has been frequently noted, the youngest showrunner in the history of network television. He had opinions about the animation direction. He had opinions about the music, which was composed by Walter Murphy, a musician who had worked with everyone from the New York Philharmonic to Dire Straits. He had opinions about the stories, the characters, the tone, and where the jokes should land. He was, in the fullest sense of the word, the author of this show, and his authorship showed in every frame. The character designs were being finalized during this period as well. Peter was designed to be visually unmistakable overweight in a way that the show never apologized for or made the subject of constant mockery, wearing his white dress shirt and green pants and glasses in a combination that somehow communicated everything you needed to know about him before he opened his mouth. Brian was designed to walk upright, dressed in no clothes, which created the particular visual comedy of a dog who was more human than most of the humans around him. Stewie, with his large football-shaped head and his little yellow shirt and his red dungarees, was designed to look like the most innocuous thing in the world, which was, of course, the entire joke. The show's setting was given a name, quahog. A quahog is a type of hard-shelled clam found along the Atlantic coast of North America, and it is very much a Rhode Island thing, not widely known outside the region, carrying a specific regional character that anchored the show's geography in something real. The town of Quahog was designed to feel like every mid-sized New England city at once, generic enough to be universal and specific enough to feel lived in. The houses on Spooner Street, where the Griffins lived, were close together in the way New England houses tend to be. The bar where Peter and his friends gathered the drunken clam had the quality of a place where people had been drinking together for decades, comfortable and a little worn down, familiar in the way that only truly good bars are ever familiar. The neighbors were being developed alongside the main family. Joe Swanson, the police officer in a wheelchair who lived next door, was introduced in the very first season. His character in those early episodes was notably different from what he would eventually become in season 1. Joe was introduced as the cool new neighbor that everyone, including Peter, was slightly intimidated by. He was tough and competent and widely admired. The wheelchair was not a punchline. It was a characteristic, one of many, and it did not diminish him in any way. Glenn Quagmire, the airline pilot with the enormous chin and the enthusiastic approach to the opposite sex, was also established early as part of Peter's social world. Cleveland Brown, soft-spoken and even-tempered and the most grounded person in the group, completed the quartet. These 4 men, Peter, Joe, Quagmire, Cleveland, would form the social core of the show. Their friendship at the Drunken Clam was, in those early seasons, a genuine friendship. They liked each other. They looked out for each other. Their conversations had the quality of men who have spent enough time together to be comfortable in silence as much as in talk, and who find each other genuinely funny. Everything was in place. The characters were ready. The world was built. The writing room was running. The animation studio Rough Draft Studios was ready to produce the episodes. The premiere date was set. Fox had given the show one of the most prestigious time slots in all of television, the Sunday night slot immediately following the Super Bowl. The 31st of January 1999 was coming, and the world was about to meet the Griffins for the first time. Section 6, January 31, 1999. The night it all started. Super Bowl Sunday. The 31st of January, 1999. The game between the Denver Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons took place at Pro Player Stadium in Miami, Florida. The Broncos won, 34-19. John Elway played his final game as a professional football player. Millions of people in living rooms across the United States watched the game and then, in the way of Super Bowl Sundays, stayed on the couch, not quite ready to return to the reality of a Sunday night that was going to become Monday morning before long. Fox was ready for them. The premiere episode of Family Guy was titled Death Has a Shadow. It opened with the Griffin family, Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, Brian, doing exactly what families do on Sunday evenings. They were watching television. The image of a family watching television, which is what the audience was currently doing, had a meta quality to it that was either deliberate or a very happy accident. The show was beginning exactly where its audience lived. The plot of Death Has a Shadow was relatively simple by the standard of what the show would eventually produce. Peter loses his job at the Happy-Go-Lucky toy factory after showing up to work drunk, begins secretly collecting welfare checks while telling Lois he is still employed, and eventually gets exposed during a Super Bowl halftime show when the money he is collecting rains down on the crowd. The episode ends with Peter avoiding jail time only because he has apparently fathered a child with the judge, though this is never revisited. It was deliberately absurd in its resolution, a clear statement of intent. This was not a show where consequences necessarily worked the way they did in reality. This was a show where the logic of comedy always outranked the logic of cause and effect. But it was also, even in this premiere episode, something else. In between the absurd plot and the first appearance of what would become the show's signature cutaway gags, there were moments of genuine warmth. When Lois found out what Peter had been doing, she was angry. Genuinely angry, not comedically angry in the way cartoon wives sometimes are. She was hurt that he had lied to her, and Peter's attempt to make things right clumsy, too big, inevitably spiraling into further disaster, was not entirely without the quality of a real person trying to fix a real mistake. The relationship between Peter and Lois in those earliest episodes had something underneath it that felt true, felt like two people who actually loved each other even when one of them was being spectacularly stupid. The premiere pulled in approximately 22 million viewers. That is a number that deserves a moment of consideration. 22 million people. To put that in context, the most watched episodes of Breaking Bad, a show now widely considered one of the greatest in television history, drew between 10 and 11 million viewers at its peak. The finale of The Wire, one of the most critically acclaimed dramas ever made, drew fewer than 2 million viewers. 22 million people watching a new animated comedy about a fat man from Rhode Island on the night of the 31st of January 1999 was an enormous number. The Super Bowl bump certainly explains some of it. Any show that airs after the Super Bowl is going to inherit an enormous audience simply because tens of millions of people have been watching the same channel for 3+ hours already, but the show earned its numbers. People did not turn the channel in those first 20 minutes. The humor was immediate and accessible. The characters were immediately legible. Peter was funny and recognizable. Lois was warm and grounded. And Stewie was already remarkable. In his very first scenes, the year-old baby with the British accent and the laser gun and the absolute seriousness about his desire to end his mother's life, Stewie registered as something unlike anything that had been on television before. The critical reception to the premiere was mixed in the particular way that critical receptions to new animated comedies often were in 1999. Some critics saw what it was immediately and responded with enthusiasm. Others were more cautious, more guarded, more inclined to see it as derivative of The Simpsons. The comparisons to The Simpsons were unavoidable and would continue for years. The dysfunctional animated family, the satirical take on suburban American life, the male lead who was well-meaning but catastrophically stupid. These surface similarities were real, but anyone who watched more than 2 episodes could already see that Family Guy and The Simpsons were doing something fundamentally different. The Simpsons was a show about a town, a community, a world that had an internal consistency and an emotional coherence. Family Guy was a show about a frequency of humor, a rhythm of comedy that interrupted itself and tangented wildly and came back home, a show that was more interested in making you laugh right now than in building toward any particular destination. The rest of the first season premiered on the 11th of April, 1999, with the episode I Never Met the Dead Man, and ran through the 16th of May, 1999, for a total of 7 episodes in the first season, the shortest season in the show's history. The show aired on Sunday nights at 8:30 p.m., sandwiched between The Simpsons and The X-Files, which was a remarkable piece of scheduling that gave it the benefit of both a huge lead-in audience and the association with 2 of the most culturally significant shows on television at the time. Those 7 episodes of the first season are worth considering individually for what they established about who these characters were. In I Never Met the Dead Man, Peter loses his driver's license, and the family discovers they have to survive without a car in suburban Rhode Island, which turns into an adventure. In Chitty Chitty Death Bang, it is Stewie's first birthday, and his character is established even more firmly as genuinely, frighteningly, funnily dangerous. In A Hero Sits Next Door, Joe Swanson is introduced as the formidable new neighbor, and Peter's jealousy of him drives the plot. In The Sun Also Draws, Peter takes Chris to a Native American casino, and the episode has a surprisingly warm emotional core in Chris and Peter's relationship. In Brian, Portrait of a Dog, Brian is the central character for the first time, entering a dog show and then refusing to perform tricks for money because he considers it degrading a story that says something genuinely interesting about dignity and what it means to be asked to be less than you are for someone. Elsa's Entertainment. These were not throwaway episodes. They were establishing a show with genuine warmth alongside the silliness. They were building characters who felt like they mattered, whose relationships with each other felt like real relationships, whose conflicts had emotional stakes even when the situations producing them were completely absurd. The first season averaged 8 million households tuning in, enough to rank the show at number 33 inches, the Nielsen ratings for that television year. For a brand new animated show on Fox, that was a solid, respectable performance. Not spectacular, but solid. The kind of performance that earned a show a second season and some room to grow. The animation in that first season had a quality that is still distinctive and much loved by the people who grew up with it. Rough Draft Studios, the Korean-American animation studio that handled the production, gave the show a looser, more hand-drawn feel than it would have in later years. The characters moved with a slightly unpolished energy that felt alive, felt like something that had been drawn by hand and not merely reproduced by a machine. The lines had a slightly rough quality to them, the movements had a slight imprecision that somehow added to the charm rather than detracting from it. This is the version of Family Guy that exists in the memories of people who were watching in 1999. The version that feels most like something that was made by people who were genuinely excited about what they were making. The cutaway gags in that first season were also different in a specific way that mattered. There were fewer of them, and the ones that existed were shorter and punchier. They arrived as bonuses, not as the primary event. A character would say something that referred to a past experience, the screen would flash to a brief scene showing that experience, and then it would return to the story already in progress. The transitions were quick, the gags were specific, and the main story, whatever Peter was doing or failing to do, whatever family crisis was unfolding on Spooner Street, was substantive enough to stand on its own without the cutaways carrying the episode. The first season also established Family Guy's relationship with music in a way that would remain distinctive. Walter Murphy's score gave the show a quality that was slightly jazzy, slightly nostalgic, warm in its orchestration, in a way that echoed the kind of television music from the 1970s that MacFarlane had grown up absorbing. The show would occasionally break into actual musical numbers, characters performing elaborate song sequences with full orchestration, which was unexpected in an animated comedy of this kind, and which reflected MacFarlane's deep personal investment in that tradition. The combination of lowbrow comedy and genuinely high-quality musical performance was one of the show's most distinctive early qualities, and it set Family Guy apart in a way that had nothing to do with the content of the jokes. By the end of the first season, Family Guy was not yet a cultural phenomenon. It was a promising new show with a specific and original voice, an excellent cast, a talented writing team, and a creator whose ambition and ability were already visible in every episode. The show was finding its audience. The audience was finding the show. And, somewhere in the chemistry of that exchange, something was beginning to build that would eventually outlast everything anyone expected. Section 7. The voices that brought it to life. A show's characters are only as alive as the people giving them voice, and the casting of Family Guy in those early seasons produced one of the most memorable ensembles in the history of animated television. Each of the main voice actors brought something specific and irreplaceable to the show, and the relationships between the characters on screen were partly a reflection of the real human beings behind the microphones. Seth MacFarlane himself was responsible for 4 of the main characters: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Glenn Quagmire. The fact that he could perform all 4 of these distinctly different voices, keep them sharply separate in performance, and voice all of them in the same recording sessions without ever blurring them into each other is a feat of vocal engineering that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Peter's voice, as previously noted, was built on the foundation of a security guard MacFarlane had known at RISD someone with a thick Rhode Island accent, a very loud voice, and what MacFarlane described as absolutely no self-editing whatsoever. The voice has a quality of unstoppable forward momentum, like a train that has lost its brakes. It rises and falls in specific patterns. It has a recognizable cadence, a set of inflections that became as familiar to anyone who watched the show as a piece of music they had heard 1,000 times. MacFarlane found early on that the physical position of Peter's voice, loud, nasal, projecting from somewhere in the upper chest, also helped him locate the character's emotional register. Peter's voice was not capable of subtlety. This was appropriate. Brian's voice lived in a completely different register. Where Peter was forward and loud, Brian was measured and precise. MacFarlane has described Brian as containing something of himself, the voice of a person who reads books and cares about good writing and thinks that standards matter, even as the world around him fails to live up to any of those standards. Brian spoke with the particular weariness of someone who is smarter than his circumstances but lacks the ability to change them entirely. The voice was lower and smoother than Peter's, drier and more controlled, with a quality of resigned intelligence that was immediately sympathetic and sometimes quietly heartbreaking. Stewie, as has been established, was built on the foundation of Rex Harrison's Professor Henry Higgins, running through the additional filter of a Bond villain coldness. But MacFarlane also added a layer that was not in either of those sources a genuine delight in his own plans, a kind of gleeful self-satisfaction that made Stewie's villainy more funny than frightening. He was not morose about wanting to kill his mother. He was enthusiastic about it. He had the energy of someone who truly loves their work, and the comedy worked in part because his cheerfulness was so completely at odds with the content of what he was being cheerful about. Quagmire's voice came from a different source than the others. MacFarlane based it on the style of 1950s and 1960s lounge singer performance. with a particular emphasis on the vocal affectations of that era, the drawn-out vowels and the sudden drops in pitch and the quality of a voice that was always performing slightly even in casual conversation. Quagmire was a character whose charm was both genuine and slightly alarming. A man who was genuinely likable in his friendship with Peter, while being genuinely disturbing in almost every other dimension of his life. The voice captured both sides of that simultaneously. Alex Borstein as Lois was essential to the show in a way that is sometimes underappreciated. The Lois Griffin voice had to do several different things at once. It had to sound like a real woman, grounded and warm, not a cartoon. It had to convey intelligence and patience and occasional exasperation without tipping into shrewishness. And it had to hold its own in scenes with Peter, where the comedy often depended on Lois being the sane person in the room, the straight man in the classic comedy sense, without being merely reactive, without losing her own personality in the process of being Peter's foil. Borstein accomplished all of this with a voice that felt effortless and natural, never strained, always present. Lois sounded like she had lived in Rhode Island her whole life and had opinions about things that mattered to her, which is exactly right for who she was. Borstein had come to the show through her work on Mad TV, the sketch comedy program on Fox, where she had developed the broad range of character voices and comedic instincts that serving as a sketch performer requires. MacFarlane cast her after hearing her do a character during a casual conversation, not in an audition context, just in the course of getting to know each other. She had been doing an impression of her landlady at the time, and MacFarlane heard in that impression the exact quality he was looking for in Lois. The directness, the practicality, the warmth with an edge to it. He cast her on the spot. Seth Green as Chris Griffin had the challenging assignment of voicing a character who was, almost by design, the least flashy member of the family. Chris was not a supervillain. He was not the lovable catastrophe. He was not the talking dog with literary ambitions. He was a teenage boy who was slightly overweight, not very smart, and good-natured in the way that not very smart, slightly overweight teenage boys sometimes are. Green found the voice for Chris in a strange and specific place. He based it on what he imagined the Buffalo Bill character from The Silence of the Lambs would sound like if he were speaking through a PA system at a McDonald's. This is a description that makes no immediate sense and yet somehow produced a voice that was exactly right for Chris. Soft, oddly earnest, slightly uncertain, recognizably young in a way that suited the character perfectly. The voice of Meg Griffin in the first season was provided by Lacey Chabert, who was at that time best known for her role as Claudia in the drama series Party of Five. Chabert brought a specific quality to Meg in those first episodes, a slight breathiness, a hopefulness that existed beneath the frustration of being the perpetually overlooked member of the family. She voiced Meg for the first season and then departed the role. Starting with the second season, Mila Kunis took over the character and has voiced her ever since. Kunis was 17 years old when she was cast, fresh from her work on That 70s Show. Her Meg had a different quality from Chabert's, slightly more dry, slightly more aware of her own awkwardness, slightly better at performing the specific emotional texture of someone who knows they are being ignored and has developed a complex relationship with that knowledge. Mike Henry, who joined the show to voice Cleveland Brown among other characters, brought a specific warmth to Cleveland that was essential to the character's function in the ensemble. Cleveland was the most even-tempered person in Peter's social group, the one who was most likely to respond to Peter's worst impulses with a gentle, reasonable attempt at redirection. Henry's Cleveland had a softness to it, a calm, that made him both funny and genuinely likable. Cleveland also occasionally had the quality of someone who was slightly tired of being the patient, reasonable one, and the moments when that tiredness surfaced were often among the funniest things the show did with the character. The combined ensemble of these voices created a soundscape for Family Guy that was immediately distinctive and strangely cozy to listen to. There is something about the combination of these specific voices, in these specific relationships, that produces a quality of audio comfort, the feeling of returning to a house you know well, where every room sounds familiar and everything in it has its place. People who watch Family Guy late at night, as many people do, are not necessarily watching for the plot. They are watching because the sound of it, the specific music of these voices talking to each other, has a quality that is calming rather than agitating, familiar rather than demanding. This is not accidental. MacFarlane was always thinking about how the show felt to be inside, what the emotional weather of watching it was like. He wanted a show that was funny but also comfortable, a show that you could watch when you needed something in your ear and your eye that was not going to exhaust you. The voices he built and cast and developed were all, in different ways, voices that invited you in rather than pushing you away. Section 8, Seasons 2 and 3, The Heart of It All. The second season of Family Guy premiered on the 23rd of September, 1999, and ran through the 1st of August 2000 for 21 episodes. This is the season that, for many of the people who have watched the show from the beginning, feels like the version they love most this season, where everything was working simultaneously, where the characters were fully established but still fresh, where the humor was both sharp and generous, where the emotional warmth that made the early show so distinctive was fully operational. The scheduling was already becoming a problem. Fox had moved the show from its successful Sunday night slot to Thursday nights at 9 p.m., where it went directly against Frasier on NBC. Frasier was at that point one of the most popular and critically acclaimed comedies on television, a show with a large and loyal audience that was not going to be poached by a new animated series no matter how good it was. The ratings dropped. They dropped more than they would have dropped on Sundays, more than the natural softening that almost all shows experience in their second season after the premiere novelty has worn off. But the quality of the episodes was rising. The writing team had found its rhythm. The characters had depth now that had not been fully available in 7 episodes. Stories could do more with Peter and Lois because the audience already knew them. Brian could be more complex because his relationship with Peter was established and understood. Stewie could be scarier, funnier, more elaborately villainous because the baseline of who he was had been set in Season 1, and the writers could now play variations on it. The second season gave the show Road to Rhode Island, which would become the first of the Road to episodes, a series of special installments where Brian and Stewie went on adventures together that became some of the most beloved entries in the entire show's history. Road to Rhode Island sent Brian and Stewie across the country on a misadventure involving a lost airline ticket and eventually Brian's complicated feelings about his family of origin. It was the first episode to really explore Brian as a character with genuine emotional depth, to show that underneath the dry wit and the martinis and the literary pretensions was someone who was capable of real vulnerability. The episode ended with Brian learning something genuinely sad about his mother, and the show held that sadness for a moment before returning to comedy, and the combination produced something that felt true in a way that cartoons did not always feel. The episode Brian in Love, from this same season, revealed that Brian had romantic feelings for Lois, feelings that he had been suppressing and that were manifesting in strange psychological symptoms. The episode handled this with genuine delicacy. It never turned Brian's feelings into something grotesque or crude. It treated them as the kind of complicated, half-acknowledged feelings that real people sometimes have for people they can never pursue, and it ended with Brian simply accepting what those feelings were and deciding to carry them quietly. This was emotional writing of a quality that animated comedies did not always manage, and it said something important about what the show was capable of when it chose to go there. Meg had a more active role in Season 2 than she would in later years. Her storylines often centered on her desire to be accepted, to find her place in the social hierarchy of high school, to be seen as more than just the uncool one. These stories were not treated as the setup for cruelty. They were treated as the real and relatable experience of adolescence, and Meg was allowed to be a fully sympathetic character working through genuine challenges. She had friends, however impermanent. She had aspirations, however thwarted. She had moments of genuine confidence, however quickly they were deflated by the reality of high school politics. Peter in Season 2 was also still the version of the character that audiences fell in love with, someone whose stupidity was clearly located in impulsive decisions and poor judgment, rather than in any fundamental incapacity for human feeling. He made a mess of things consistently and reliably, and the mess-making was funny. But when the episode reached its end, there was almost always a moment of reckoning where Peter understood what he had done and tried, in his clumsy way, to make it right. He told Lois he loved her. He apologized to his kids. He made some gesture of recognition that, yes, the latest catastrophe had been his fault, and yes, he was sorry. The cycle of mistake and repair was the moral architecture of the early show, and it was what made the Griffin family feel like a real family rather than simply a collection of people living at the same address. The cutaway gags in Season 2 were still operating as bonus material rather than primary content. They were sharper and more varied than they would later become, and they had a quality of precision that came from the writers having to earn each one, having to construct a setup that genuinely called for a cutaway, rather than simply inserting one wherever there was space. The best cutaways in these early seasons had a structure to them. The setup line created a specific expectation. The cutaway subverted that expectation in a specific way, and the return to the main story felt like a clean landing rather than an abrupt cut. This structural care was part of what made them funny. When you strip away the structural care, you have something random. What the early show had was something with logic to it, even when the logic was purely comic. Season 2 also featured the show's first genuine musical number of note, a lavish production number performed by Peter with choreography that clearly required significant animation resources, the kind of elaborate sequence that demonstrated the production's willingness to spend its budget on something purely in service of a joke. These musical sequences became one of Family Guy's most distinctive features, a quality that separated it from nearly every other animated comedy on television. The show was genuinely good at them. The choreography was inventive. The vocal performances, particularly McFarlane's, were legitimately strong, and they had the quality of genuine entertainment rather than mere novelty. Season 3 arrived in July of 2001 and ran for 22 episodes through the spring of 2002. By this point, the show was already in its third time slot in 3 seasons. Fox had moved it again, this time to Thursdays at 8 p.m., where it ran directly against Friends, which was at that point the most watched show on American television. This was not a competitive scheduling decision. This was the kind of scheduling that kills shows. And yet Season 3 produced some of the finest episodes in the show's entire history. The Thin White Line, which opened the season, sent Brian to a drug rehabilitation center after his stint as a narcotics dog leads him into cocaine addiction, an episode that managed to be both genuinely funny and genuinely empathetic about addiction in a way that was unusual for a comedy. Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows featured Brian forming an unlikely emotional connection with a shut-in he had been assigned to care for under court order, and included a musical sequence that won the show its first Emmy Award for Outstanding Music and Lyrics. Road to Europe sent Brian and Stewie to Europe on an adventure that included a memorable sequence set at the Vatican and a developing portrait of their friendship that felt increasingly like the real emotional center of the show. And Family Guy viewer mail number 1, the final episode of the season before the show was canceled, was a format-breaking episode that showed 3 separate imagined scenarios and demonstrated the writer's willingness to experiment with the show's own conventions. It was during Season 3 that the show's voice reached something close to a peak. The writing was consistently sharp. The characters were fully alive. The emotional warmth was present in every episode, even when the comedy was going to very dark places. And the show had developed a specific quality that is difficult to describe precisely, but is immediately recognizable when you encounter it: a quality of generosity toward its own characters. The Griffins in Seasons 1 through 3 were not targets. They were people the show loved, even as it made them look ridiculous. The comedy came from affection, not contempt. The specific tone of those 3 seasons has been described by fans and critics in many ways over the years. The word that comes up most often is warmth. The show was warm. It was generous. It was silly in a way that never felt mean. It was willing to be genuinely moved by its own characters, willing to let them have real moments of feeling that landed before the comedy resumed. This quality, call it the heart of the early show, was present in every Season 1 and Season 2 and Season 3 episode, embedded so deeply that it felt structural rather than tonal, like it was part of the architecture rather than the decoration. This was the show that the audience fell in love with. This was the show they would spend years trying to get back to. Section 9. The cancellations Fox kills their own show. The story of Family Guy's cancellations is, in some ways, a story about a network that did not know what it had and did not know how to protect it. The first near cancellation came at the end of the second season in May of 2000. Fox had been shuffling the show around its schedule since the beginning of its second year, moving it from Thursday at 9 p.m., where it competed with Frasier, to other slots that offered no improvement. The ratings had dropped from the first season's 12.8 million households, and Fox, which at this point had already demonstrated an extraordinary willingness to interfere with its own shows' chances by moving them without warning or consistency, decided they had seen enough. They canceled Family Guy. Then, 2 months later, they reversed the decision. Fox gave the show a third season, possibly motivated by a realization that they had acted too quickly, possibly motivated by a desire to have something on Sunday nights that they had not yet properly exploited. The third season was ordered and began airing in July of 2001. The third season scheduling was the problem that finally broke the show's back. Thursday nights at 8 p.m. against Friends. The most watched show on American television, at the absolute peak of its cultural ubiquity, in a time slot that Friends had owned for years and that nobody was going to take from it. Family Guy was not going to beat Friends. Nothing was going to beat Friends in that slot in 2001. The ratings dropped sharply and stayed down. Fox made its second and final cancellation decision in the spring of 2002. The last episode to air on Fox in the initial run was the 21st of March 2002. One episode of the third season remained unaired by Fox, a story called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, in which Peter attempts to find a Jewish financial advisor. Fox refused to air this episode, citing concerns about its content. The episode would eventually air on Adult Swim over a year later, completing the show's original run in an appropriately incongruous way. MacFarlane reacted to the cancellation with a combination of disappointment and pragmatic acceptance. He was already working on American Dad, which Fox had commissioned as part of the original deal that brought Family Guy back for Season 3, and there were other projects and possibilities available to him. But the loss of Family Guy was real. He had built this show from scratch, had poured enormous energy and creative investment into it, and now it was over. Or at least, it appeared to be over. What happened next was something that the television industry had essentially never seen before. Cartoon Network had been watching Family Guy with interest for a while. The Adult Swim programming block, which had launched on Cartoon Network in 2001, was explicitly designed to serve adult animation viewers with a sensibility that was different from what network television offered. Adult Swim in those early years had a specific late-night aesthetic, strange, experimental, slightly surreal, operating with a freedom from conventional network notes that allowed it to take creative risks that no broadcast network would permit. Shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force and The Brak Show were finding audiences on Adult Swim that appreciated exactly this quality of freedom. Cartoon Network approached Fox about acquiring the rerun rights to Family Guy. Fox, which had canceled the show twice and no longer saw significant value in it, agreed to a deal that the president of 20th Century Fox Television would later describe as giving the rights away for almost nothing. Cartoon Network had taken a show that Fox had essentially written off and paid almost nothing for the right to air it. This may be one of the most consequential bargain purchases in the history of television. Family Guy premiered on Adult Swim on the 20th of April 2003. The response was immediate. Almost overnight, Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block. Night after night, the show attracted viewership numbers that Adult Swim had not seen at that point in its young existence. The audience that was finding Family Guy on Adult Swim in 2003 was slightly different from the audience that had watched it on Fox. It was younger, more likely to be college age, more likely to be watching late at night, and more likely to be the kind of viewer who told other people about what they had watched. Word of mouth, which had always been one of the mechanisms by which cult followings develop, was operating powerfully in Family Guy's favor. Simultaneously, and this is the part that changed television history in a lasting way, the DVD market was doing something extraordinary. Fox had released the Season 1 and Season 2 DVD sets, and those sets sold with a speed and in numbers that nobody in the industry had expected. The combined first two seasons sold approximately 2.2 million copies, making them the best-selling television DVD release of 2003, second only to the first season of Chappelle's Show. More than 2 million people bought physical copies of a canceled animated series, which said something very clearly about the strength and the loyalty of the fan base that had built around this show during its initial run. The DVD sales were the critical factor that triggered Fox's reconsideration. In 2003, DVD sales were a significant and growing revenue stream for television studios, and 2.2 million units at the retail prices of that era represented a substantial amount of money. Fox was looking at that money, and they were looking at the Adult Swim ratings, and they were doing the math. By 2004, Fox had made the decision to order new episodes of Family Guy. A fourth season was commissioned. The show that had been canceled twice was going to come back. This had never happened before, a show canceled twice, brought back specifically on the basis of DVD sales and cable rerun ratings, with no guarantee that the original creative team could be reassembled or that the audience's interest would survive the 3-year gap. It was unprecedented in every dimension, and it worked. The announcement of Family Guy's revival was greeted by its fans with the kind of enthusiasm that is usually reserved for events much more important than the return of a cartoon. Online communities that had formed around the show, this was the era of early internet fan communities, before social media, but during the period when internet forums were the gathering places for devoted audiences, reacted with what can only be described as genuine joy. These were people who had watched the show during its original run, bought the DVDs, watched the reruns on Adult Swim, and held on to the belief that this specific thing they loved deserved a second chance. Now it was getting one. The 4th season was scheduled to premiere on the 1st of May 2005. 3 years had passed since the show went off the air. The writing team would have to be partially rebuilt. The tone would have to be recaptured. The characters would have to be found again, brought back to the place they had been left. All of this was doable, probably. The question was whether the show that came back would be the same show that had left. Section 10. The Resurrection, Adult Swim, and the DVD Revolution. The revival of Family Guy in 2005 was one of the most widely covered television events of that year, which says something about how thoroughly the show had embedded itself in the culture during its 3 years off the air. Magazines ran retrospectives. Television critics wrote about what the cancellation and revival meant for the industry. The idea that a show could be killed by a network and then resurrected by its own audience was something that the entertainment industry had not quite encountered in this form before, and there was genuine interest in what it signaled about the changing relationship between content and audience, between networks and viewers. The Adult Swim connection was central to this story. Adult Swim, in the years between Family Guy's cancellation and revival, had built itself into something genuinely significant in the landscape of American television. The block, which aired on Cartoon Network from 11 p.m. onwards, had developed a specific identity that spoke very clearly to a demographic that the broadcast networks were beginning to lose: young adults, college students, the kind of viewer who was willing to stay up late for something that felt genuinely different from what primetime offered. Adult Swim shows operated with a freedom that was palpable. They could be stranger, darker, more experimental, less concerned with conventional story structure. They could fail interestingly in ways that network shows almost never got the chance to fail. When Family Guy's reruns started appearing on Adult Swim in 2003, they fit into this context in a way that felt almost designed. The show's humor, which had always had an experimental, structure-subverting quality in its cutaway gags and its willingness to follow a tangent, matched the Adult Swim sensibility. And the show's characters, who felt lived in and real and funny in a way that rewarded repeated viewing, were exactly what late-night rerun viewing calls for. You can watch a show you already love in a different way when you are watching it at midnight, more relaxed, more receptive, more willing to let it wash over you. The boosted viewership that Adult Swim reported for Family Guy was remarkable. The network said that Family Guy's reruns had boosted their viewership by 239%. This was not a marginal improvement. This was the kind of number that changes how a network thinks about itself, changes what it pursues next, changes the calculation of what kinds of programming are worth acquiring. And for Fox, watching all of this from a distance, it was a clear signal that the audience they had given up on had not gone anywhere. The DVD phenomenon was equally significant and in some ways more historically consequential. Family Guy was the first television show to be revived specifically on the basis of DVD sales. This had never happened before because the DVD market for television had not previously been large enough or important enough to influence network decisions at this level. The late 1990s and early 2000s were the period when home video shifted from VHS to DVD, and with that shift came a dramatic expansion in what people were willing to spend on owning television content. Shows that had been canceled years earlier, that people remembered fondly and wished they could see again, were suddenly available in complete season collections for around $30 a set, and people bought them. The implications of this were enormous, though they took a few years to fully work themselves out. If an audience could buy a canceled show on DVD and keep that show alive through their purchasing behavior, and if that behavior could eventually signal to a network that reviving the show would be commercially worthwhile, then the relationship between audience and content had fundamentally changed. The audience had power that it had never had before. A show did not have to succeed in its first run if it could build a devoted enough audience over time. The network's decision to cancel was no longer necessarily the final word. For Family Guy specifically, the DVD revival told a story about a particular kind of viewer loyalty. The people who bought those DVD sets in 2003 were not casual viewers. They were people who had watched the show on Fox during its original run, had felt the loss of it when it was canceled, and had chosen to invest real money in having a physical copy of it. They were fans in the fullest sense of the word, not passive consumers, but active participants in keeping a piece of culture alive that they valued. When Season 4 premiered on the 1st of May 2005, Fox placed it as the anchor of what they were calling Animation Domination, a Sunday night block that included The Simpsons, American Dad, and eventually other animated comedies. Family Guy was the centerpiece of this block, the show around which the rest were organized, the proof that Fox's animated primetime strategy was serious. The return drew enormous ratings. The audience that had built over 3 years of Adult Swim reruns and DVD viewing was there, and they had brought their friends. What the revival also did was something more complicated and ultimately more consequential. It changed the show's relationship to its own audience. The people watching Family Guy in 2005 were not quite the same people who had watched it in 1999, or rather they were the same people, but they were now watching with a different kind of investment. They had fought for this show. They had bought the DVDs, they had watched the reruns. They had, in a real sense, brought the show back from the dead. This created a sense of ownership, of earned relationship, that is different from the relationship you have with a show you simply discovered on the schedule one Sunday night. And it created a standard of quality based on what the show had been during those first 3 seasons that every subsequent episode would be measured against. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The Adult Swim and DVD revival of Family Guy was one of the most wonderful things that ever happened to the show. It kept something alive that deserved to be alive. It demonstrated the power of audience loyalty in a way that changed how the entire industry thought about canceled shows, and it gave millions of people back something they had lost and missed. All of these things are true, but the revival also created something more complicated, an enormous, passionate, specific fan base whose emotional attachment to the show was based on those first 3 seasons, whose standard for what Family Guy should be was defined by those years, and who would spend the next 2 decades noticing the distance between the show they loved and the show that was currently airing. Section 11. Season 4. A New Beginning. The 4th season of Family Guy is a document of a show finding itself again after 3 years away. It is not quite the show that left in 2002, but neither is it fully the different thing it would eventually become. It exists in a middle space, familiar but slightly changed, warm but slightly cooler, sharp but slightly less precise than the sharpest early episodes had been. This is not a criticism so much as an observation about the inevitable effects of time and change on any creative enterprise. The most visible change in Season 4 was the animation. Rough Draft Studios, which had handled the 2nd and 3rd seasons with that loose, slightly rough quality that fans had come to love, was still involved, but the style had shifted. The animation was cleaner, smoother, and, in a technical sense, more polished. The outlines were thicker. The movements were more controlled. The overall visual quality had a glossier feel that reflected the increased budget and the longer production timeline. What it lost in the process was some of the scrappy energy that had given the earlier seasons their distinctive look, that sense of something made by hand, still finding its proportions, still slightly imperfect in ways that felt alive. The character designs had also evolved subtly. Peter was slightly more refined in his proportions. Brian's movements were slightly more fluid. The background art was more detailed. None of these changes were dramatic, but taken together they produced a show that looked somewhat different from the version audiences remembered, and this difference was part of the experience of watching the return. The writing was also different, for the reason that MacFarlane had acknowledged openly the original writing team had scattered during the 3-year hiatus. Writers who had moved on to other projects did not simply return when the show came back. New writers had been hired. People who knew the show and loved it and were talented, but who brought different sensibilities to the room than the original team had. The voice was still recognizable. The humor was still sharp. But the specific chemistry of those early seasons, the exact combination of sensibilities that produced something like When You Wish Upon a Weinstein or Brian in Love or Road to Rhode Island, was not quite reproducible because some of the elements that had created it were no longer in the room. What Season 4 did bring, alongside these changes, was an energy that came directly from the knowledge that the show had been saved by its own audience. There was something almost celebratory about the early episodes of the revival, a quality of knowing Winx, of shared history, of the show being aware of its own story in a way that it had not needed to be before. The premiere episode of Season 4 was titled North by North Quahog, and it began with a scene of Peter and Lois waking up to discover that a few years had passed and things had changed. This was the show acknowledging, as directly as it could within the context of a comedy, that time had passed and things were going to be a little different now. The cutaway gags in Season 4 started to become more prominent than they had been in the original run. This was a subtle shift, noticeable mostly in retrospect. At the time it felt like more of the same, just more of it. But episodes started to lean on the tangential asides more heavily, started to use them as structural elements rather than simply as bonuses. The main stories were still present and still coherent, but the weight that carried the comedy was shifting slightly from the narrative to the gags. This shift had a logic to it that was partly technological. Family Guy had returned in the era of early YouTube. The video sharing platform launched in February of 2005, the same month that Family Guy was being prepared for its return. Within months of the show's comeback, clips from Family Guy were appearing on YouTube in enormous numbers. The cutaway gags were perfectly suited for this format. They were self-contained, they were short, they required no context. You did not need to know what episode they were from or what the larger story was. You could watch a 30-second cutaway with no knowledge of the show and find it funny, then share it with someone who had never seen the show, and they could find it funny too. Family Guy became one of the first shows to be genuinely viral on the internet, and the cutaway format was the engine of that virality. This created a feedback loop that would matter enormously over the following years. The more popular the viral clips were, the more the production became focused on creating moments that would work as standalone clips. The more the production focused on standalone moments, the more the episodes themselves became collections of standalone moments rather than complete stories. The logic was commercially understandable. If what people were sharing was the cutaways, then more and better cutaways was the path to continued visibility in a media landscape that was becoming increasingly fragmented and attention compressed. But it was a trade-off. Every minute spent on a cutaway was a minute not spent on character development or story. Every moment that functioned as a standalone clip was a moment that did not require the audience to care about what happened before or after it. Over time, the cumulative effect of this trade-off would be significant, but in Season 4, the trade-off was not yet severe enough to notice in any sustained way. The season produced strong episodes. It had the road to episodes, which were always among the best the show did, and it had standalone episodes that showed the characters at their best. Brian Sings and Swings, in which Brian forms a jazz duo with a young Frank Sinatra Jr., was one of the funniest and most musically accomplished things the show had done. The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire episode, which dealt with the genuinely dark subject of infidelity between close friends, showed that the show could handle real emotional weight when it wanted to. Season 5, which ran from 2006 to 2007, continued the trends of Season 4 while also producing some of the episodes that are most frequently cited by fans as highlights of the revival era. Stewie Loves Lois, the season premiere, showed a completely different dimension of the Stewie and Lois relationship. Instead of Stewie plotting to destroy her, the episode explored what happened when Stewie realized he genuinely loved his mother and wanted her attention. It was a reversal of the show's fundamental premise, played with enormous comic energy, and it showed the kind of creative freedom that comes from knowing your characters deeply enough to subvert them. Road to Rupert, another Brian and Stewie adventure episode, sent the pair on a cross-country trip to recover Stewie's beloved teddy bear, and was as warm and funny as any Road to episode had been. Barely Legal, in which Meg develops a crush on Brian after he takes her to her prom, showed that even Meg, despite being the most systematically overlooked member of the family, could be the center of a story that had genuine heart. The show was still, in seasons 4 and 5, capable of the warmth that had defined the original 3 seasons. The family still loved each other in ways that were visible beneath the chaos. The comedy was still rooted in character more than in randomness. The voices were still the voices of people who felt like real people, even the supervillain baby. The cracks were there, if you looked closely enough. Peter's cruelty was slightly more present than it had been. The meg-abuse was beginning to escalate. The cutaways were more frequent and slightly less precise. But these were cracks in a wall that was still standing, fissures in a foundation that was still sound. The show was still Family Guy, still recognizably the thing that people had loved enough to bring back from the dead. It would take a few more seasons for the wall to become something different, for the fissures to spread in ways that could no longer be overlooked. But that is a story for another night. Right now, in the glow of the revival, the Griffins were still the Griffins. Stewie was still plotting. Brian was still drinking. Peter was still being Peter. And somewhere in Providence, Rhode Island, a show that almost never happened was continuing to live. Family Guy's place in the world. What it meant and what it made. Let's step back from the chronology for a while and think about what Family Guy actually was in the context of the larger story of American comedy. Because the show's origins and its early years represent something genuinely significant in that story, and it is worth naming it clearly. When Family Guy premiered in January of 1999, it entered a television landscape that was already producing excellent adult animation. The Simpsons had been running for a decade and had, during its peak years in the early 1990s, achieved something close to a perfect synthesis of heart and humor and social intelligence. South Park had been running for 2 years and was already established as the most formally experimental animated comedy on television, willing to skewer anything and anyone, and to use its cartoon form as a vehicle for genuine ideological argument. These were the standards against which any new animated comedy would inevitably be measured. Family Guy survived that comparison not by matching those shows on their own terms, but by doing something different from either of them. The Simpsons was a world show. Springfield was a complete universe with its own internal logic, its own history, its own community of fully developed characters that the show had spent years building. South Park was an argument show every episode built toward a point, however chaotic the path to that point might be. Family Guy was something else. Family Guy was a comedy of interruption, a show that constantly broke its own momentum to make a different kind of joke, that treated continuity as something to be disrupted rather than maintained. This was its form, as much as cutaway gags were its technique. This form proved to be deeply suited to the particular moment of its creation, and even more suited to the moment of its revival. The late 1990s and early 2000s were the beginning of the era of fragmented attention, the first years when the internet was beginning to compete seriously with television for time and focus. People were increasingly comfortable with their viewing being interrupted. They were increasingly used to the experience of following something for a few minutes and then diverting to something else and then coming back. Family Guy's cutaway format felt native to this environment in a way that more traditionally structured shows did not. The show also arrived at the right moment for its specific brand of comedy, the pop culture reference-heavy, meta-aware, deliberately referential humor that would come to define so much of internet comedy in the decade that followed. Family Guy made jokes that assumed you knew who Rex Harrison was, what Rocky III was about, what a particular moment from 1980s television looked like. These jokes required a specific kind of media literacy to fully appreciate, and the show operated on the assumption that its audience had that literacy. This was a form of respect, a way of treating the viewer as someone with a full cultural memory who could be trusted with complexity. The audience responded to this trust by becoming extraordinarily devoted. The competition and rivalry between Family Guy and South Park is worth a moment's consideration because it illuminates something real about where both shows sat in the landscape of adult animation. South Park creator Trey Parker has been openly dismissive of Family Guy's writing, most famously in the 2006 two-part episode Cartoon Wars, in which the cutaway gags were depicted as being written by manatees randomly pushing idea balls together, a direct parody of what Parker and Matt Stone considered to be the fundamental randomness of Family Guy's comedy. This criticism stung, and it landed, and it was partly right about the direction the show was heading in the revival era, even if it was unfair as a description of the show at its best. What Parker and Stone were objecting to was the show at its weakest, The cutaways that really were random, that really could have appeared anywhere without changing anything. What they were not accounting for was the show at its strongest, the episodes where the characters were fully alive, where the family's love for each other was present and real, where the comedy came from genuine insight into character rather than from the shock of juxtaposition. Those episodes existed in Family Guy, particularly in its first 3 seasons, in numbers sufficient to build a very strong case for the show as a genuinely accomplished work of American comedy. The cultural footprint of Family Guy, measured by its influence on the comedy that came after it, is enormous and sometimes invisible in the way that the most pervasive influences tend to be. The cutaway gag as a storytelling technique, the sharp, format-breaking aside that comments on what is happening and then snaps back, became one of the dominant idioms of internet comedy in the 2010s. Every YouTube video that cuts away to a reaction shot, every tweet that sets up a premise and then interrupts itself with an absurd tangent, every TikTok that changes direction mid-sentence is, in some distant but real way, doing what Family Guy taught people was funny. The form spread outward from the show into the culture so thoroughly that people who have never seen an episode of Family Guy are making jokes in a style that Family Guy helped create. The show's particular brand of celebrity parody and pop culture deconstruction also became formative. Family Guy treated famous people and famous movies and famous songs as raw material for comedy, as things you could take apart and put back together in unexpected ways, as text that the audience knew well enough to subvert. This was not entirely new. The Simpsons had done versions of it. Saturday Night Live had always done it, but Family Guy did it with a specific frequency and a specific irreverence that felt new in the context of a weekly narrative animated series. The marketing and merchandising empire that built up around Family Guy was also genuinely remarkable. The show became a billion-dollar franchise, a number that Seth MacFarlane mentioned in interviews, somewhat casually, as a marker of how thoroughly the show had established itself commercially. T-shirts, toys, video games, keychains, drinking accessories, the full range of things that a show licenses when it becomes a cultural institution rather than simply a television program. The merchandise revenue meant that Family Guy had a commercial existence separate from its ratings, an income stream that did not depend on how many people watched new episodes on a given Sunday night. In 2009, Family Guy did something that The Simpsons, despite 16 seasons of critical acclaim and cultural dominance, had never managed to do. The show was nominated for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series. This was the first time an animated series had received this nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, nearly 50 years earlier. The nomination was not simply an honor for Family Guy, it was a statement that animated comedy could be taken seriously enough to compete directly with live-action comedy for the most prestigious award in American television. The show lost that year to 30 Rock, but the nomination itself had already made its point. In 2013, TV Guide ranked Family Guy as the 9th greatest television cartoon of all time. This was a list that included The Simpsons, Looney Tunes, Scooby-Doo, Bugs Bunny, and the other icons of the form. To be placed 9th in that company, with only a decade and a half of history behind the show, was a marker of how thoroughly it had made its mark on the culture. The show's revival, and the mechanism of that revival, the DVD sales and the Adult Swim ratings that brought it back, changed how the television industry thought about canceled shows and about the relationship between audience behavior and network decisions. Within a few years of Family Guy's return, the idea of reviving canceled shows on the basis of post-cancellation audience interest became a strategy that networks and streaming platforms would pursue deliberately. It has become commonplace now. The show canceled too soon, the audience petition, the streaming platform pickup, the revival announcement. Family Guy did not invent this pattern, but it was the first major demonstration that the pattern was possible, that a show's first run was not necessarily its last word. The 25-year anniversary of Family Guy's premiere, which arrived in January of 2024, was greeted with a kind of affectionate retrospection that acknowledged both what the show had been and what it had become. People who had grown up with the original seasons were by then in their 30s and 40s, watching the show's current episodes with the complex feelings of someone who remembers what it was like and is measuring the distance between then and now. This distance between the warmth of seasons 1 through 3 and the show's later trajectory is real, and the people who felt it genuinely. But the original 3 seasons are still there, still as funny as they ever were, still carrying the specific quality that made millions of people feel like this was their show. The story of how Family Guy came to exist, from a boy drawing Fred Flintstone on whatever surface was available, to a 24-year-old sitting in a Fox conference room with 15 minutes of hand-animated footage and 4 voices living in his throat, is the story of what happens when genuine talent meets genuine obsession, and is given, however improbably, the exact right opportunity at the exact right moment. MacFarlane had been building toward that conference room his entire life. The security guard at RISD, whose voice he absorbed without knowing he was absorbing it, the student film made in a dorm room with equipment that cost almost nothing, the years at Hanna-Barbera learning the professional architecture of what he already knew, instinctively. All of it was preparation for a meeting that lasted 15 minutes and produced a show that has been running for over a quarter century. The Griffin family, in those first 3 seasons, had the quality that only the best things have, the quality of feeling necessary, of feeling like something that should have existed and simply needed to be made. Peter and Lois and Meg and Chris and Stewie and Brian felt like people you had always been about to meet, as though they had been just around a corner in the culture before Seth MacFarlane turned the corner and introduced them. The specific magic of the early show was the magic of contrast held in balance, the absurdity balanced against the warmth, the darkness balanced against the affection, the loudness balanced against the gentleness, Stewie's menace balanced against his loneliness, Brian's wit balanced against his failures, Peter's stupidity balanced against his love. None of these things worked without their counterpart. The show lived in the space between them. This is the show that began on a cold Sunday night in January of 1999, when 22 million people settled into their living rooms after the Super Bowl and discovered a fat man from Rhode Island, his patient wife, his overlooked teenage daughter, his clueless son, his homicidal baby, and his talking dog. These characters walked into American living rooms that night and never quite walked out. And that, in the end, is the thing worth remembering about where this all started. Not the network interference, not the cancellations, not even the extraordinary resurrection story of the DVD sales and the Adult Swim ratings. The thing worth remembering is that a 24-year-old named Seth MacFarlane spent 6 months alone in his apartment making something he believed in, with $50,000 and a voice that could become anyone, and the thing he made was good enough to deserve all the rest of the story that came after it. He got to that conference room because he had never stopped drawing since he was 2 years old. Because he published a comic strip at 8 and placed in a cartoon competition at 11 and watched The Simpsons at 14 and made a thesis film at RISD at 21 and then remade it slightly better at 22 and then rebuilt it entirely into something new at 24. Each step was the preparation for the next one. Each thing he made was teaching him how to make the next thing. The boy from Kent, Connecticut, who drew Fred Flintstone before he could reliably read, ended up creating one of the most recognizable animated families in American television history. Stewie Griffin, who never existed until MacFarlane asked what would happen if a baby were the smartest person in the room, became one of the most quoted and most loved and most reproduced characters in the history of the form. Brian Griffin, who started as a talking dog named Steve in an 11-minute student film, became the character that millions of people felt genuinely grief-stricken about when the show briefly killed him off in 2013. Peter Griffin, built on the voice of a campus security guard with no internal filter, became the kind of character that people see a little bit of their own father in, or their own uncle, or themselves on their worst days and somehow still love. This is the origin, the art school dorm room and the student film, and the $50,000 pilot and the Super Bowl premiere and the 22 million viewers who showed up that first night. The voices that never quite existed before MacFarlane found them, the characters who felt like they had always been waiting to be introduced, the show that was canceled and came back and was canceled again and came back again because the people who loved it refused to stop loving it. Somewhere in Connecticut, the boy who drew Woody Woodpecker and wanted to know how cartoons were made grew up and made one. He made one that started as a story about a hapless man and his talking dog and became, over 25 years and hundreds of episodes, something that a large portion of an entire generation considers part of the furniture of their minds, the wallpaper of their late nights, the familiar sound in the background of the comfortable hours. That is where it came from. That is who built it. That is why it exists. And now you know the whole story from the very beginning, and if you have made it this far, you can let your eyes close and let your breathing slow and know that somewhere in a fictional Rhode Island town, the Griffins are still gathered in their living room, still bickering, still loving each other badly and genuinely, still very much themselves. Sleep well. If you enjoyed this journey through the origins of Family Guy, it would mean a lot if you gave this video a like. It genuinely helps the channel more than you might think, and it takes about half a second. And if you want to be here for the next story we tell, subscribing is completely free and ensures you will never miss one. Thank you for spending this time here. I will see you in the next one. Section 13. The Anatomy of a Cutaway. How the show's signature device actually worked. One of the things that made Family Guy distinctive from its very first episode was the specific technique that would eventually become its most recognizable feature and simultaneously its most debated one. The cutaway gag deserves a dedicated examination, not just a quick mention in passing, but a real look at what it was, where it came from, how it functioned in the early seasons when it was working at its best, and what made it different from the lazy version of itself that it would sometimes become in later years. The mechanical description is simple enough. A character makes a reference to something usually framed as a comparison, often beginning with a line like, "This is worse than the time when," or "That reminds me of," and the screen cuts away from the main story to show a brief, separate scene that illustrates that reference, usually in an absurd or unexpected way. The scene plays for anywhere from a few seconds to a minute or more, and then the story resumes as though nothing has happened. That is a cutaway. That is the whole technical description. But the experience of watching a well-constructed cutaway is considerably more complex than the mechanics suggest. When a cutaway works, when it really lands, the way the best ones do it achieves several things simultaneously. It delivers a joke, obviously, but it also briefly expands the world of the show, briefly suggests that the characters we are watching have a richer history than any single episode could contain, briefly gestures at a universe of experience that lives off-screen. A well-constructed cutaway is like a window onto a larger world, opened for just a few seconds before being shut again. This quality, the suggestion of depth beyond what is currently visible, was part of what made the early Family Guy so enjoyable to inhabit. The show felt lived in. Peter and Brian and Stewie and Lois felt like people who had been doing things and experiencing things and referencing things for years before the camera found them. The cutaways were the evidence of that. When Peter mentioned the time he tried to arm wrestle a mailman or the evening Stewie spent attempting to rewire the neighborhood's electrical grid, these references created the impression of a continuous life behind the story currently being told. This is a classical technique in good character, writing the suggestion of a life beyond the frame, but Family Guy deployed it in an unusually direct and comedic way. Seth MacFarlane has spoken about the origins of the cutaway format in interviews over the years, and the creative lineage he traces is illuminating. He has cited the influence of old-school variety television, the Ed Sullivan Show era, the Dick Van Dyke Show era, in which sketch comedy and more structured narrative would alternate within a single hour, creating a rhythm of interruption and return that was fundamental to how those programs worked. He has also cited the specific quality of being a funny person in a social context, of how genuinely funny people operate in conversation, not staying on a single topic, branching wildly, following the funnier thread wherever it leads, returning to the main conversation later. The cutaway format was an attempt to put that quality of live, spontaneous comedy into a scripted form. The Simpsons had done something adjacent to this with its own tangential humor, but The Simpsons generally kept its tangents within the main narrative characters, referred to past events, but those references usually functioned within the story rather than interrupting it entirely. What Family Guy did was more radical. It fully paused the main story, left it in suspension, went somewhere completely different, and then came back. This was a more aggressive form of the technique, and it placed a much higher demand on the cutaway itself to justify the interruption. A weak cutaway in Family Guy was more noticeable than a weak tangential joke in The Simpsons, precisely because it had stopped the story to make room for itself. The writer's room process for creating cutaway gags was a specific and somewhat unusual part of how Family Guy was produced. As Steve Callahan, one of the show's most prolific writers, described it, The process often involved splitting the writing team into smaller groups, what they called gag rooms, where 4 or 5 writers would go off together and spend an hour pitching as many possible cutaways as they could think of. For a specific setup, they might generate 30 or 40 ideas in that hour. Some terrible, some passable, occasionally one that was genuinely excellent. The best ideas from each gag room would come back to the full group, and MacFarlane would make the final determination about which ones went into the episode. This process had a particular effect on the quality of the cutaways. Because so many ideas were generated for each slot, and because only the best survived the selection process, the cutaways that made it into the episodes in the early seasons tended to be the genuinely funny ones, the ones that had beaten a large field of competitors to earn their place. The filtering was rigorous. The standard was high, and this showed in the finished episodes. The early cutaways were also characterized by a specific kind of imaginative commitment. They did not simply illustrate whatever comparison had been made in the setup line. They often went somewhere unexpected, somewhere sideways, adding a dimension to the joke that the setup had not fully anticipated. The best ones worked on multiple levels. They were funny as images, they were funny as concepts, and they had a specific relationship to the context of the main story that made them feel earned rather than random. The relationship between setup and cutaway in the early seasons was thought about carefully. The writers were asking not just, is this funny, but is this the right funny for this moment? The physical comedy that animated cutaways made possible was also essential. Animation frees comedy from the constraints of physical reality. A live-action show is limited by what actors can physically do and what can be practically produced on a set. Animation imposes no such limits. A cutaway could depict Peter flying, or a talking piece of furniture, or a historical figure in an anachronistic situation, or a recreation of any moment from any movie or television show, all at equal cost and with equal visual freedom. This limitlessness was both the opportunity and the risk of the format. The opportunity being that the jokes could go anywhere the imagination could follow, and the risk being that anywhere sometimes leads somewhere that is just random rather than funny. The most beloved cutaway gags from the early seasons share a quality that is worth identifying. They feel surprising in retrospect, which is the highest thing you can say about a joke. They go somewhere that, having arrived there, you cannot believe you did not see coming, because it is so perfectly the right place for the joke to go. This quality, the joke that feels both surprising and inevitable, is what separates a well-written cutaway from a random one. The random one could have gone anywhere. The well-written one could only have gone here. The format also had an interesting relationship with the show's musical identity. MacFarlane's deep love for the big band and jazz idiom meant that many of the most memorable cutaways had a strong musical component, characters bursting into song. Elaborate musical numbers that required the full orchestral apparatus of Walter Murphy's score, moments where the comedy and the music reinforced each other in ways that were genuinely delightful. The musical cutaways were often the most expensive to produce in terms of animation and scoring, but they were also often the most memorable. They showed the full range of what the form was capable of when all the elements were working together. Understanding the cutaway gag as a form, understanding what it can do at its best, and why it sometimes fails is part of understanding Family Guy itself, because the cutaway is the show's most fundamental expressive tool. It is the medium through which the show's specific comedic intelligence expresses itself most directly. When the cutaways were sharp and purposeful and well-constructed, they were the show. When they became filler, the show lost something that was difficult to replace. The story of the cutaway gag's evolution across the show's seasons mirrors the story of the show itself, from precision and craft at the beginning to something broader and less controlled as the years accumulated. But in the early seasons, in the years we have been talking about, the cutaway gag was a joy. It was the thing that made watching Family Guy feel like a specific and irreplaceable experience, like no other show was quite doing what this one was doing in quite this way. And that feeling of being in the presence of something that had found its own form and was using it with real skill was the foundation of everything that followed. Section 14. The sounds of Spooner Street, Walter Murphy, and the music of Family Guy. There is a quality in Family Guy's musical identity that most people register intuitively without being able to precisely name. If you have watched more than a few episodes, particularly the early ones, There is a warmth in the score in the specific way the music underscores scenes, in the orchestral choices, in the particular combination of nostalgia and contemporary energy that runs through the show's musical life. This quality comes primarily from one person, Walter Murphy. Walter Murphy is one of those figures in American music whose career defies easy categorization. He was known in the 1970s primarily for his disco production work, most notably his 1976 recording, A Fifth of Beethoven, which took the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and transformed it into a disco track that became a global hit and appeared memorably in the film Saturday Night Fever. But Murphy had also worked as an orchestral arranger and composer across a far wider range of contexts, and it was this broader musical literacy, the ability to work in jazz, in orchestral pop, in classic Hollywood musical idioms that made him the right choice for Family Guy. MacFarlane approached Murphy for the show because Murphy's sensibility aligned with his own in a specific way. Both men had deep affinities for the music of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, the era of big band orchestration, of Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, of the full studio orchestra scoring that had defined Hollywood film and television through those decades. MacFarlane's personal musical taste had always run toward this era, and he wanted a show that felt musically like it belonged somewhere in a continuum that stretched from that golden age forward rather than existing purely in the contemporary moment. Murphy delivered exactly this. The Family Guy score has an orchestral richness that is unusual for a primetime animated comedy. Where most animated shows in this period used relatively spare musical accompaniment, smaller ensembles, more electronic elements, music that served primarily as a background signal rather than an expressive element, Family Guy used a full orchestra. Murphy's arrangements drew on the language of the jazz orchestra and the classic Hollywood score, deploying brass sections and string arrangements and full rhythmic sections in a way that gave the show a musical warmth that reinforced its tonal warmth. This mattered more than it might seem. Music in television comedy serves several functions, not all of which are obvious until they are absent. The most obvious function is underscoring, indicating the emotional register of a scene, signaling to the audience whether to feel tender or tense or silly. Family Guy's score did this reliably, but it did something more interesting as well. The orchestral warmth of Murphy's arrangements gave the show a sense of history, a sense that these characters existed in a world with weight and texture rather than in the flat, effectless present that some animated comedies inhabit. The Griffins, sonically, felt like they lived in a real neighborhood in a real town, and part of that feeling came from music that sounded like it had been written for people whose lives mattered. The show's use of musical numbers was a direct expression of MacFarlane's personal passions, and these numbers, at their best, were legitimately impressive pieces of comedy and entertainment. The show would periodically take a break from its narrative and present a full-scale musical production number, an elaborate, choreographed, orchestrally accompanied sequence in which a character, usually Peter, would perform a song with the energy and production values of an actual musical. These sequences required significant animation resources and Murphy's full orchestral treatment, and they had the quality of something that someone really loved was making. The Road to episodes, the Brian and Stewie Adventure specials, were particularly strong showcases for the show's musical identity. These episodes consistently included original songs written for the characters, performed with genuine vocal and orchestral craft, that functioned both as comedy and as actual music. Road to Rhode Island included a song called You've Got a Lot to See, in which Brian sang about his own emotional history in a style that was simultaneously funny and genuinely moving. This song won Family Guy its first Emmy Award for Outstanding Music and Lyrics, which was a validation not just of the specific song, but of the show's commitment to musical quality as a genuine creative value rather than a gimmick. MacFarlane's own voice was, of course, central to the show's musical life. He had been trained as a singer and had a genuine baritone voice that could handle the demands of the jazz and pop standards he loved. When Peter or Brian broke into song, the comedy worked partly because the performance was actually good because you were genuinely hearing something with musical quality rather than simply an actor doing a funny voice. This commitment to actual musical accomplishment, in a genre where comedy could easily have substituted for competence, gave Family Guy's musical moments a dimension that set them apart from comparable moments in other animated comedies. Murphy's score also had a specific relationship with the cutaway gags. Because cutaways moved the show suddenly into a completely different scene with a completely different emotional register, they required rapid musical adjustments. The score had to pivot immediately to whatever tone the cutaway demanded, and then pivot back just as quickly when the main story resumed. Murphy developed a facility for this kind of rapid tonal modulation, and the seamlessness of the musical transitions between main story and cutaway contributed to the show's sense of casual confidence. Its quality of knowing exactly where it was at every moment. The music of Family Guy is one of those invisible foundations that holds everything else up without calling attention to itself. Nobody tunes into a Family Guy episode primarily to hear Walter Murphy's orchestrations. But the specific warmth and comfort of the show's sound, the particular quality of being inside this specific world with these specific characters, is inseparable from what Murphy provided week after week for 2+ decades. The show sounds the way it sounds because of him, and the way it sounds is part of why it feels the way it feels. Section 15. The Griffins and Their World, a deeper look at the supporting cast. Family Guy was always at its core about 6 people: Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and Brian. But the world around them, the neighbors, the friends, the recurring characters who populated Spooner Street and the Drunken Clam and James Woods Regional High School, was what gave the show the quality of a living community rather than simply a family sitcom. Glenn Quagmire is perhaps the most complex of the supporting characters in terms of what he does for the show's tonal balance. His function is superficially clear. He is the character whose enthusiastic approach to women provides a reliable source of shock comedy, but within that function there is more going on than might first appear. Quagmire in the early seasons was funny in ways that went beyond the single note of his sexual appetite. He was Peter's friend, genuinely and warmly, and the friendship between them had a quality of real affection that made both characters more interesting. Quagmire cared about Peter in the way that only someone who has watched someone be magnificently stupid for years and chose to keep showing up can care. He had a dry self-awareness about his own appetites that prevented him from becoming simply repellent. And he occasionally displayed a depth of feeling in stories about his family, about his past, about the people he had genuinely loved that complicated the simple picture of a man defined entirely by one characteristic. MacFarlane based Quagmire's voice on the vocal style of mid-century lounge entertainers, the kind of performer who worked hotel bars in Las Vegas in the 1960s, who had a smooth surface manner that covered a certain darkness underneath. The elongated vowels, the sudden drops in pitch, the particular rhythm of delivery, all of these came from hours MacFarlane had spent listening to recordings of that era, absorbing a style of performance that no longer quite existed and trying to distill it into a single character. Joe Swanson, as introduced in the first season episode A Hero Sits Next Door, was one of the show's most interesting character experiments. He was introduced as the cool neighbor, the one everyone on the street was slightly awed by, the one whose competence and toughness made Peter, usually the most confident person in any room he was in, feel genuinely outclassed. The episode was structured around Peter's jealousy of Joe, his attempt to compete with him, and his eventual arrival at a grudging but genuine respect. Joe happened to be in a wheelchair, and the show was careful in those early episodes to treat the wheelchair as simply part of who Joe was, rather than as the defining fact about him. He was cool and tough and competent first, and the wheelchair was one of several things that were true about him. This portrayal of Joe was quietly notable in 1999 and early 2000s American television. Characters with disabilities in comedy were far more likely to be the subject of pity or patronizing humor than to be genuinely formidable presences. Joe was formidable. He was the kind of person who, if you were in trouble, you would want on your side. The show treated him with the respect that genuine strength deserves, and in doing so, it made a small but real contribution to the representation of disability in mainstream comedy. Cleveland Brown, Peter's other close friend in the original ensemble, represented a different kind of character function. Where Joe provided toughness and competence as a counterpoint to Peter's chaos, Cleveland provided patience and groundedness. He was the voice of calm in a group that was constantly threatening to spiral out of control. His speech patterns were deliberate and considered. His reactions to Peter's worst impulses were often the most measured in the group, not because Cleveland was simple or slow, but because he had clearly spent enough time with Peter to have developed a set of strategies for managing his own responses to the situation. Cleveland was also, from the beginning, a character who had a life that existed separately from his friendship with Peter. He had a wife, Loretta, who was a presence in the early seasons. He had a perspective on the world that was his own, shaped by his experience as a black man in a fictional Rhode Island city that was overwhelmingly white in its visual presentation. The show did not always engage deeply with this dimension of Cleveland's character, but it was present, and it gave him a specificity that went beyond being simply one quarter of Peter's friend group. The Pewter-Schmidt family, Lois's wealthy parents, Carter and Barbara, provided a recurring contrast between Peter's working-class world and the upper-class New England milieu from which Lois had come. Carter Pewter-Schmidt, voiced by Seth MacFarlane, was one of the show's most reliably funny recurring characters in the early seasons. He was the specific type of inherited wealth patrician who combined enormous condescension with complete obliviousness to his own ridiculousness. His contempt for Peter was performed with such confidence that it became its own comedy, the complete certainty of a man who has never for a moment doubted his own superiority, meeting the chaotic reality of a son-in-law who is genuinely impossible to classify. MacFarlane played Carter with a specific vocal quality imperious, projecting from somewhere deep in the chest, each consonant crisped by decades of private school education that made him instantly and reliably funny. Barbara Pewter-Schmidt, also voiced by Alex Borstein, was a softer presence, a woman who had clearly spent decades navigating between her husband's certainties and the reality that other people existed and had their own realities. Borstein's performance of Barbara was a small masterpiece of character acting, finding the specific kind of warmth that exists in people who have been shaped by difficult marriages but have retained their essential kindness intact. Dr. Elmer Hartman, the Griffin family physician, was another recurring character who embodied a specific kind of comedy, the professional incompetent, the person whose position of authority was completely unmoored from any actual competence to hold it. Dr. Hartman in the early seasons was funny specifically because his incompetence was so thorough and so cheerfully unconscious. He was not malicious. He did not know he was doing anything wrong. He performed the mannerisms and used the language of medicine with complete confidence while understanding essentially nothing about it. This is a recognizable human type, the person who has mastered the performance of competence without the substance, and the show found considerable comedy in him during those years. Meg's social world, her peers at school, the particular social ecosystem of James Woods Regional High School, was sketched in with enough specificity to feel real without being fully developed. Connie D'Amico, the popular girl who served as Meg's primary antagonist in the school setting, was a recognizable archetype executed with some precision. The cruelty of high school popularity hierarchies? The specific way that certain kinds of confidence in adolescence depend on the presence of someone less confident to define themselves against. These were dynamics that the show understood and depicted with enough accuracy to feel true rather than simply cartoonish. The town of a fictional Rhode Island city itself was a character in some ways, or at least a setting with enough personality to function as one. The Drunken Clam, where Peter and his friends gathered to drink and discuss and periodically make terrible decisions together, had the quality of a real bar, not a generic comedy bar set, but an actual place with history and regulars, and a particular kind of afternoon light and the smell of old beer in the walls. The brewery where Peter eventually worked, the high school where Meg and Chris suffered through their adolescent years, the neighborhood where the houses were too close together and the lawns were small and the summers were probably too short, all of these felt like Rhode Island. Specifically, rather than like the anonymous suburban anywhere of a generic American sitcom. This specificity of place was one of the early show's quiet assets. MacFarlane had spent 4 years in Providence and had absorbed the specific texture of small city New England in a way that translated into the show's geography and atmosphere. The show felt like it was set somewhere real, and this grounding made the comedy feel more earned. The contrast between the absurd events happening to these characters and the completely ordinary background of their lives was funnier because the background was real rather than decorative. Section 16. What the early show understood about family. The most enduring quality of Family Guy in its original 3 seasons, the thing that people who watched it then still talk about when they talk about what made those episodes special, was something that seems almost too simple to be the whole answer, but keeps coming back in every honest account of what separated the early show from what came later. That quality was love. The Griffins loved each other. Not perfectly, not without conflict, not without the specific cruelties that families inflict on each other precisely because they are close enough to know exactly where it hurts. But genuinely, underneath everything, with the specific warmth that people who have made a life together generate between themselves even when they are being terrible about it, Peter loved Lois. This was the show's most foundational fact, the premise that everything else sat on top of. Their relationship was not equal. Peter was frequently oblivious to Lois's needs, frequently prioritized his own impulses over her wishes, frequently put his entire family in jeopardy for reasons that made sense only inside the specific logic of his own head. But when he had caused a catastrophe and found himself on the other side of it, looking at his wife and understanding that he had hurt her, he was capable of something that many television husbands are not capable of: genuine remorse. He felt bad. Not performed bad, not strategically bad as part of a reconciliation plot, genuinely bad, the way a person feels when they have hurt someone they love. And that feeling, even when it was expressed clumsily or wrapped in more chaos, was real. Lois loved Peter back. This is equally important, and perhaps even more demanding of the audience's acceptance, because Lois was clearly more intelligent and more capable and more practically competent than Peter, and there is a question that any honest viewer of the early show eventually arrives at. Why is she with him? The answer the show gave was a good one, even if it was never stated directly. Lois was with Peter because Peter, beneath the chaos and the stupidity and the bad decisions, had a specific quality of genuine enthusiasm for living that was magnetic and irreplaceable. He was never boring. He was never cautious. He threw himself into things with a total absence of self-protective reserve that was exhausting to be around and was also, in its way, exhilarating. And he loved her specifically, loved Lois rather than just needing someone in the wife position. This was clear in those early episodes in ways large and small. Brian loved his family. This was perhaps the most complicated of the love stories in the early Griffin household, because Brian's intelligence and his self-awareness and his literary aspirations all pointed in one direction, while his actual life pointed in another. He lived in a family that was mostly beneath him, by any intellectual measure, and he knew it. He stayed anyway. He stayed because the connection was real, because the affection was genuine, because there was something in Peter's cheerful obliviousness that Brian found, despite himself, deeply companionable. Two people who are exact opposites can be better friends than two people who are similar, if the friendship is between the right two exact opposites. Brian and Peter were the right two. Stewie's love was the most complicated of all, because Stewie had constructed his entire identity around the opposite of love, around the pose of the cold, intellectual supervillain who felt nothing for anyone. The comedy of Stewie in those early seasons depended entirely on the gap between this performance of villainy and the reality of a child who, beneath all the laser guns and the world domination plans, wanted what all children want: to be seen, to be held, to be told that he mattered. The attempts to kill Lois were, at some level, a child's expression of complicated feelings about his mother, a way of reaching out that had gotten twisted into something dangerous somewhere in the extraordinary machinery of Stewie's mind. Brian saw through the performance. That was why their friendship was the most emotionally true relationship in the show. Meg and Chris and their relationship with each other and with their parents in those early seasons was also drawn with a care that later seasons would mostly abandon. Chris and Meg squabbled the way siblings squabble, with specific, targeted cruelties that revealed exactly how well they knew each other, but they were not vicious about it. They were in the same boat, two children of a catastrophic father and an extraordinary mother, navigating an adolescence that was never going to be simple. There was a solidarity there, unspoken, beneath the sibling friction. And all of this, all of the love, in all its complicated, imperfect, frequently disastrous forms, was what the early show was about. Not the cutaway gags, not the shock humor, not the pop culture references. Those were the delivery system. The actual substance was the family. The actual substance was the question that every good family sitcom asks. What does it mean to belong to people, to be claimed by them and to claim them back, to love someone despite and because of exactly who they are? The Griffins answered this question in ways that were funny and sometimes genuinely moving, ways that recognized the mess and the difficulty of family life without ever losing sight of the love that made the mess worth sustaining. This was the heart of the show. This was what those 22 million people responded to on the 31st of January 1999. Not the cutaways, not the transgression, not the boldness of having a baby who wanted to murder his mother. Those things were the packaging. Inside the packaging was something warmer and older and more universal than any of them. A story about a family that loved each other badly, which is the only way most families have ever known how to do it. Section 17. Seth MacFarlane. At 24, the youngest showrunner in television history. The fact that Seth MacFarlane became the youngest showrunner in the history of network television at the age of 24 is one of those biographical details that is so extreme, it sounds like something a writer invented for effect. It is, however, completely true, and it is worth sitting with because it illuminates something important about both MacFarlane himself and about what made the early seasons of Family Guy feel the way they did. A showrunner in American television is the person who runs the show, not the network executive who commissioned it, not the studio executive who oversees the production, but the person inside the day-to-day creative machinery who makes the decisions, what stories get told, how characters develop, what jokes stay in, and what jokes get cut, what direction the series takes in any given week, and over the course of a season. The showrunner is the author of the show in the most practical sense, the person whose specific creative intelligence shapes everything the audience eventually sees. At 24, Seth MacFarlane was doing this job on a network primetime animated series that premiered to 22 million viewers. He was managing a writing staff of 8 or 9 people, all of whom were older than he was, and many of whom had more professional experience in television. He was overseeing the animation production, which involved hundreds of people across multiple studios in the United States and Korea. He was voicing 4 of the show's main characters. He was working with the network on episode approvals. He was simultaneously one of the youngest people in every room he was in and the person in charge of every room he was in. The people who worked with him in that period, writers, animators, voice actors, have described the experience in ways that all emphasize the same quality. MacFarlane was young, but he was not uncertain. He knew what the show was. He knew what it needed. He had specific, detailed opinions about jokes, about timing, about character, about tone. He was not improvising a vision, he had a vision. And he was executing it, and the execution was disciplined even when the comedy was anarchic. This specific combination of youth and certainty produced an unusual quality in the show. Family Guy in its early seasons had the particular energy of something made by a person who was too young to be cautious. MacFarlane had not yet accumulated enough professional experience to develop the self-censorship that years in the industry tend to install. He had not yet been burned badly enough by the television business to become defensive about his creative instincts. He was making the show he wanted to make with the tools available to him, and his confidence in the rightness of that show was absolute, in the way that confidence in 24-year-olds sometimes is not based on a long track record, but on the kind of deep self-knowledge that some people simply arrive at early. The youth of the creative engine behind Family Guy also connected the show to its audience in a specific way. The people who were watching in 1999, the core demographic of young adults in their late teens and 20s, were watching a show made by someone who was essentially one of them. MacFarlane was 25 when the show premiered. He was closer in age to a college freshman watching the show on their dorm room television than he was to the network executive who had commissioned it. The humor reflected this. It was the humor of a specific generation, a specific cultural moment, a specific set of references and sensibilities that belonged to people who had grown up with the same things MacFarlane had grown up with. The references in the early episodes had an organic quality that came from this generational alignment. When Family Guy made a joke about a 1980s action movie or a 1970s television theme song or a specific moment from classic film, these were not the references of someone who had researched them to seem relatable. They were the references of someone who had actually grown up watching those things, who had absorbed them as the natural furniture of their mind, who made them the way you make any reference to something that has always been part of how you understand the world. This organic quality fades when it is replaced by researched comedy, by jokes that are built around references that the writers have looked up because they think the audience will respond to them. rather than references that come from genuine shared experience. The early Family Guy had the former quality almost entirely. The jokes felt like they came from somewhere real, rather than from a demographics report. And this authenticity, however hard to precisely define, was part of what made the show feel alive. MacFarlane's position as the youngest showrunner in television history also meant that he was growing as a person and as a creative professional in public, which is both an opportunity and a kind of exposure that most people are protected from. The show's evolution over its early seasons reflects his evolution, the confidence becoming more settled, the range of tones becoming wider, the emotional ambition of individual episodes growing as his trust in the form and in his own ability to control it increased. Watching the first 7 episodes of Season 1 and then the best episodes of Season 3 is the experience of watching someone learn and develop in real time, and the development is genuinely impressive. He was also, during this period, carrying an enormous amount personally. The production pressures of running a network animated show are substantial under any circumstances. Running one at 24, while also voicing multiple main characters, while also managing the complex politics of a network relationship and a writing staff, while also trying to continue developing as an artist, this was a significant load. MacFarlane has spoken, in various interviews over the years, about the difficulty of that period, about the exhaustion and the pressure. But what came through in the finished episodes was not exhaustion. What came through was enthusiasm and craft, and the specific pleasure of someone who has found the work they were meant to do and is doing it. The story of those early years, MacFarlane in his late 20s, running a show that had come back from the dead and now occupied the most prestigious time slot on Fox, voicing 4 characters, managing a writer's room, shaping the animation, composing his musical contributions, building the world of this show in every direction simultaneously, is the story of someone being completely equal to a very large challenge. Not without difficulty, not without cost, but equal to it. The show was exactly as good as it needed to be, which is the highest thing you can say about any creative endeavor. Section 18. The cultural moment. What made 1999? The right year. History has a way of making certain things seem inevitable after the fact, of smoothing over the contingency of real events and making them look like they could not have happened any other way. Family Guy premiering in January of 1999 does not feel inevitable in retrospect. It feels deeply contingent dependent on a specific set of cultural circumstances, technological conditions, and timing elements that combined in a way that created an opening just large enough for the show to step through. The television landscape of 1999, in the specific moment of Family Guy's premiere, was in a particular state that is worth describing carefully. The Simpsons had been running for a decade, and was still, at that point, considered to be operating at the high end of what it could do. The years generally considered the show's peak. Seasons 4 through 8 were only recently in the past. The Simpsons in 1999 was not yet the long-running institution it would later become, with all the complicated feelings that go with 20 or more season-run shows. It was still the show that had proved animated comedy could be great, and it was still producing episodes of genuine quality. South Park had been running for 2 years, and had already established itself as the most radical formal experiment in animated comedy. The show's deliberately crude animation, a style that was partly a joke about cheap TV animation and partly a genuinely effective creative choice that freed it from the visual expectations of more polished shows, and its willingness to go anywhere in service of a satirical argument had made it one of the most discussed shows on television. South Park was the show that sophisticated viewers who wanted to believe animation could be art pointed to as their primary evidence. This left a specific gap in the landscape that Family Guy was perfectly positioned to occupy. There was no show that occupied the territory of being warm and irreverent simultaneously, funny in both an absurdist sense and a genuinely emotional sense, willing to be dark and shocking but also willing to be tender. The Simpsons was warm but operated with a specific kind of restraint that prevented it from going to the places Family Guy went. South Park was fearless but cold, in the specific way that a show primarily interested in ideas rather than characters tends to be cold. Family Guy combined elements of both without being either. It was warmer than South Park and wilder than The Simpsons, and in that combination it found an audience that had not quite known it was waiting for something. The specific cultural mood of 1999 999 was also important. The economy was excellent. This was the height of the technology boom, before the dot-com crash of 2001 and years before the financial crisis of 2008. The country was not at war. The national mood, while not unclouded, had a baseline comfort to it that made audiences receptive to comedy that could be dark without being desperate, transgressive without being nihilistic. Family Guy's particular brand of humor, shocking but fundamentally warm, dark but not despairing, was well calibrated to this moment. The Super Bowl premiere was not just commercially significant, it was culturally significant in a specific way that is easy to overlook. Placing a new show immediately after the Super Bowl sent a message about the show's status and the network's belief in it. It said, "This is something we think is worth introducing to the largest possible audience." It said, "We think that among the 22 million people watching the Super Bowl, most of them will be interested in this." This created a kind of pre-legitimacy for the show. It arrived with the implicit endorsement of Fox's highest confidence programming decision, and audiences responded to that context even when they were not consciously aware of it. The period between 1999 and 2002, when Family Guy first ran, was also the last period in American television before streaming services fundamentally changed the relationship between shows and audiences. In 1999, if you wanted to watch Family Guy, you watched it on Sunday nights on Fox because that was the only way to watch it. If you missed it, you missed it. You could not catch up on Hulu or Netflix or Amazon. You could not binge the season over a weekend. The relationship between the show and its audience was organized around a weekly appointment, and shows that worked within that structure that gave their audiences a reason to come back every week had a kind of presence in cultural life that is harder to achieve in the fractured, on-demand environment of current television. Family Guy worked within this structure beautifully. Each episode was complete in itself. You did not need to have seen the previous episode to understand the current one. The Griffins were always ready to receive you, however long it had been. This accessibility was one of the show's greatest assets in its original run, and it remains one of the reasons it works well as the late-night comfort viewing it has become for millions of people who are watching episodes from decades ago for the fourth or fifth time. The Internet of 1999 was also in a specific state that mattered. The fan communities that formed around Family Guy in those early years, the message boards, the early websites, the proto-social media spaces where fans gathered to discuss episodes and share enthusiasm, were small enough to feel intimate but large enough to be consequential. These communities were the foundation of the loyal fan base that would eventually save the show from its second cancellation. They were the people who bought the DVDs, who watched the Adult Swim reruns, who sent Fox the letters and the emails that the network eventually added to their calculation about whether revival was worthwhile. Fan communities in 1999 and 2000 had a different quality from what they would become in the social media era. They were slower, more deliberate, organized around longer-form discussion rather than rapid-fire reaction. The people who gathered in those early Family Guy online spaces were fans in a very specific sense. People who had thought about the show carefully enough to want to write about it, who had noticed things that casual viewers had missed, who had developed opinions about individual episodes and characters and jokes that went beyond simple liking or disliking. This was the audience that would prove most loyal in the years ahead, and the early show had earned that loyalty by being exactly good enough to deserve it. Section 19. The mythology of Griffin, family life, backstory, history, and lore. One of the underappreciated pleasures of watching Family Guy in its early seasons is the gradual revelation of the Griffin family's history, the backstory elements that fill in the picture of how Peter and Lois got together, where they came from, what they were before the show began. These backstory elements, deployed carefully across the first 3 seasons, gave the Griffins a sense of depth and history that made them feel like real people rather than characters constructed purely for comedic purposes. Peter's history was sketched in with a specific kind of affectionate detail. His background was working-class Irish Catholic New England. The specific cultural texture of that community rendered with accuracy, the particular combination of warmth and stubbornness, and occasional explosive frustration, the deep commitment to family loyalty alongside a complete inability to communicate feelings in any way that was not indirect or comedic. His complicated relationship with his faith, his reverence for his mother alongside his complicated feelings about his strict father Francis, his tendency to find his primary male bonding in bars and sports and physical work, all of these details accumulated over the early seasons into a portrait of a man from a recognizable tradition. The Griffin family's financial situation was also drawn with care. Peter worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory in the first season, before moving to the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, and the specific economic reality of a working-class family in a mid-sized Rhode Island city was present in the texture of their lives. They were not poor. They owned their house on Spooner Street. They could afford some luxuries. The family was stable in the way that double-income families in the 1990s were stable, but they were not comfortable in the way that Lois's parents were comfortable. There was a real class difference between the world Peter had come from and the world Lois had grown up in, and the show played that difference for comedy that was also genuinely observant. Lois's backstory was its own rich vein. She had grown up wealthy. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, was one of those figures of old New England money whose primary relationship to the world around him was one of serene condescension. She had been educated at exclusive schools, had been expected to marry within her social class, had presumably had a number of alternatives available to her that did not involve a working-class toy factory employee from a small Rhode Island city. She had chosen Peter. The show gave this choice a motivation. Lois had been attracted to Peter's complete absence of pretension, his utter groundedness in the physical world, his inability to perform anything other than exactly what he was. After growing up surrounded by people who performed social roles with elaborate skill, Peter's incapacity for this kind of performance was, apparently, genuinely appealing. This dynamic between Lois and Peter, between the woman who had access to a much more privileged world and the man who represented a completely different social reality, was one of the most interesting ongoing tensions in the early show. It gave their relationship a complexity that went beyond the standard television husband and wife dynamic. Lois was not simply tolerating Peter. She had made a choice, had understood what she was choosing, and had chosen it fully. This made her a more interesting character than she would have been if the marriage had been simply the result of circumstance. The children's backstories were developed more briefly but with similar care. Meg's history as the child who had always felt overlooked, who had been reaching for her family's attention from the time she could reach, was consistent across the early seasons and gave her storylines an emotional coherence that made them meaningful rather than simply comic. Chris's history as the child who had inherited his father's physical type and some of his mental approach to the world, but who had also developed an artistic sensitivity that came from somewhere else entirely, possibly from Lois's side of the family, possibly from nowhere in particular, as these things sometimes arrive, was present in the early episodes in ways that made him more than simply Peter Jr. Stewie's backstory, in the early seasons, was almost entirely unexamined, and this was deliberate and correct. Stewie worked precisely because his origins were mysterious. A year-old child who had arrived in the world with a fully formed evil genius intellect and a Bond villain's rhetorical style was much funnier and more interesting as an unexplained fact than he would have been as a character, whose origins were carefully explained. The mystery was part of the comedy. The complete absence of any backstory that could account for who Stewie was made him funnier, not less funny. Brian's backstory was the most carefully developed of all the supporting characters, and it was developed through the show's willingness to take him seriously as a character with genuine emotional depth. His mother had died early. He had come to live with the Griffins as a puppy and had been there ever since. He had attended Brown University, a biographical detail that was simultaneously funny and perfectly right. Brown being the Ivy League school with the most artistic and literary reputation, the school that a slightly pompous failed writer, who also happened to be a dog, would naturally have attended. He had been working on a novel for years that he could not finish. He had romantic aspirations and romantic failures in roughly equal measure. All of these details, accumulated over the first 3 seasons, produced a character who was genuinely known, genuinely understood, the way you know and understand a person who has been in your life for a long time. The mythology of Spooner Street, the specific neighborhood, the specific houses, the specific relationships between neighbors also accumulated over these early seasons into something with genuine weight. The Swanson house next door was not just a location. It was a place with a history, with a specific family inside it that the Griffins had real relationships with. The Quagmire house was not just where Quagmire lived. It was a location that had absorbed years of its occupants' specific personality and reflected it back in the comedy that arose from it. The neighborhood felt like it had been there for decades, like people had been living in these houses and knowing each other's business and periodically getting on each other's nerves for longer than any of them could clearly remember. This quality of accumulated history, the sense that the show's world had a depth that extended backward in time beyond what any single episode could fully reveal, was one of the specific pleasures of the early Family Guy. That is easy to undervalue. It is the quality that makes rewatching those episodes feel different from watching them the first time, because you bring to the rewatch a knowledge of the characters and their world that enriches the early episodes with meanings you could not have had access to when you first saw them. Section 20. The larger legacy, what Family Guy started, what it built, and where it lives now. There is a version of the story of Family Guy that focuses primarily on what the show became, the debates about quality, the Flanderization of characters, the evolution of the cutaway gag from precision instrument to blunt instrument, all the complicated feelings that come with watching something you love change in ways you do not love. That is a real story, and it matters. But there is another version of the story. The version this particular journey has been tracing, which is the story of what the show was at the beginning and what it started. And that version of the story is genuinely wonderful, genuinely worth sitting with and appreciating for what it is. Family Guy, in its original 3 seasons, was one of the most original and accomplished animated comedies in the history of American television. The show that Seth MacFarlane built from a student film made in a dorm room was, in its finished form, a work of genuine art, unpretentious about it, funny above all else, but art nonetheless. It had character, vision, craft, and heart in proportions that are difficult to achieve, and that the show's creator had been building toward his entire life. The influence of that original show on the comedy that came after it is impossible to fully measure because it is everywhere. The cutaway gag has become a fundamental element of the comedy vocabulary in ways that reach far beyond Family Guy itself. The specific combination of warmth and transgression that the early show perfected has become a template for animated comedy that can be traced in dozens of shows that followed. The demonstration that a revival could happen, that an audience could bring a show back from cancellation through the sheer force of its devotion, changed the economics and the culture of television in ways that are still working themselves out. The franchise that grew from those 3 early seasons is, by any measure, enormous. The billion-dollar figure that MacFarlane mentioned in interviews is likely an understatement by now, when the full accounting includes not just DVD sales and merchandise and licensing, but streaming revenue across multiple platforms and international distribution in dozens of countries. Family Guy is watched around the world, recognized on every continent, quoted in languages its creator does not speak. The characters' faces appear on objects in countries whose names Peter Griffin would certainly mispronounce. The show's continued existence, its 2, 4+ seasons, its renewal through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television year is one of those facts that would have been completely unimaginable to anyone who sat in that Fox conference room in May of 1998, watching a rough, hand-animated pilot made for $50,000. The distance between that pilot and the institution that the show has become is almost too large to comprehend. Almost. What makes it comprehensible, ultimately, is the through line. Stewie is still there, in some version, speaking with that clipped British cadence that Seth MacFarlane built from Rex Harrison's performance in a 1964 musical film. Brian is still there, still failing to finish his novel, still drinking slightly too much, still the most intellectually capable person in the room, and still not quite capable of making his life work the way he knows it should. Peter is still there. Lois is still there. The characters that MacFarlane built from nothing in his dorm room and his apartment and his borrowed writer's office are still occupying their place on a fictional Rhode Island street, still being themselves, still recognizably the people they were when 22 million viewers met them for the first time on a cold January night in 1999. That continuity across 25 years and however many hundreds of episodes is its own kind of remarkable thing. The show has changed, certainly. It has gone through the changes that any long-running creative enterprise goes through. It has had its best years and its difficult years. It has lost some things and found others. It has been celebrated and criticized, and celebrated again with the particular warmth that nostalgia generates for things we loved when we were young. But at the center of it, the same characters are still there. The boy from Kent, Connecticut built them well enough that they survived everything. The cancellations and the revivals and the years and the changes in the culture and the changes in the show itself, they are still there. And on late nights around the world, in the particular quiet of houses where the day has ended and the lights are low and someone needs something familiar and warm in their ear, the Griffins are still available, still arguing, still surprising, still, underneath everything, loving each other the only way they have ever known how badly and genuinely and for as long as it lasts. That is the legacy of where it all started. That is what a student film made in a dorm room and a 15-minute pilot made for $50,000 in a Los Angeles apartment eventually became. That is what happens when the right person finds the right idea at the right moment and has the specific kind of faith in it that only people who have been building towards something their entire lives are able to sustain. Seth MacFarlane drew his first cartoon at 2 years old and never really stopped. Everything since then has been the consequence. If this story kept you company tonight, if it helped the hours pass a little more gently, or gave your mind something warm to settle into, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. Give it a like if you feel like it. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. And wherever you are tonight, whatever time it is, I hope you sleep well. Section 21. The Anatomy of the Early Episodes. A closer look at the best of what the show was. There is value in spending time with specific early episodes, in going inside them and looking at how they actually worked, because the craft of those episodes is more sophisticated than it is sometimes given credit for. The show is remembered primarily for its excesses, the cutaway gags, the transgression, the willingness to go somewhere shocking, but the construction of its best early episodes was careful and structurally intelligent in ways that deserve more attention. Take the Season 1 episode A Hero Sits Next Door, which introduced Joe Swanson and was the episode in which the show first fully articulated the specific dynamic it was interested in exploring between Peter and Lois. The episode begins with a simple premise. A new neighbor has moved in next door, and everyone in the neighborhood is impressed by him. For Peter, who occupies the role of the most confident person in any room he is in, this is a problem. The episode is built around the comedy of Peter's insecurity, not his stupidity, not his impulsiveness, but specifically his fear of being outshone, of being made to feel small, which is one of the most universal and recognizable of all human experiences. What the episode does with this premise is more interesting than a simple story of jealousy would be. It allows Peter's insecurity to drive him toward increasingly absurd compensatory behaviors, but it also allows the episode to develop a genuine affection for Joe that persists past the point where the comedy requires it. Joe is not simply the object of Peter's jealousy, he is a fully realized character who earns the respect of the neighborhood legitimately, and by the end of the episode, Peter's journey is not simply toward embarrassing himself and then reconciling, but toward a genuine recognition of someone else's worth. This is a more emotionally sophisticated arc than most comedy episodes bother with, and it is delivered with enough comedic energy that the sophistication never feels heavy or didactic. The episode also contains one of the most perfectly executed physical comedy sequences in the first season, in which Peter attempts a series of increasingly ambitious athletic challenges to demonstrate his own value in comparison to Joe. The animation in this sequence, even with the rough quality of the first season's production, is expressive and well-timed in a way that makes the comedy work at a level beyond just what is written on the page. The animators and the director had found the specific quality of physical movement that made Peter's failures funny rather than merely pathetic, and this distinction matters enormously in physical comedy. The Season 2 episode Brian in Love, mentioned earlier, is worth examining in more detail because it represents one of the clearest early examples of what Family Guy could do when it committed to character. The episode begins with what appears to be a straightforward comedy premise. Brian has been doing embarrassing things, urinating inside the house, generally behaving in ways that are inappropriate for an adult household dog, and the mystery of why he is doing this is the engine of the story. As the episode develops, the answer is revealed. Brian is sublimating feelings for Lois that he has never allowed himself to fully acknowledge. The urination incidents are symptoms of psychological disturbance caused by unexpressed emotion. This is not the usual territory of an animated primetime comedy. The episode is asking the audience to take seriously the idea that a talking dog has developed a genuine romantic attachment to his owner's wife, has been carrying those feelings for years, and that the comedy of the situation is intertwined with something genuinely poignant. The episode manages this tonal combination with remarkable skill. It is funny, the comedy of a dog in a therapist's office, the comedy of the revelation itself, the comedy of Brian's attempt to pretend the feelings do not exist, but it is also sympathetic. Brian's situation is one that most people can understand in their own terms. The experience of having feelings for someone you cannot pursue, of carrying something unresolved, of not being fully sure what you actually feel. The resolution, Brian acknowledging his feelings to himself, deciding they are not something he will act on, choosing to let the situation remain as it is not a comedy resolution. It is a grown-up resolution, the kind that real people arrive at when they understand themselves well enough to accept something difficult. It gives the character a depth that the episode's comedy had been building toward, and it leaves you feeling that you have spent time with someone real. The Season 3 episode, The Thin White Line, which opened what would turn out to be the show's final original season before the cancellation, is one of the most formally ambitious things the early show attempted. Brian has been working as a narcotics detection dog for the police, a job that gives him the kind of external purpose and professional status his writing career has never managed to provide. But exposure to the drugs he is detecting leads him into cocaine addiction, and the episode treats this arc, the slow corruption of a character who is fundamentally trying to do right, the specific way that addiction distorts and reorders a person's values, with a seriousness that is unusual in animated comedy. The episode works because of Brian's established character. We know Brian well enough by this point in the show to understand exactly what it costs him to become someone who lets his addiction override his judgment and his relationships. We care about his decline because we care about him. The comedy in the episode is real. There are genuinely funny moments throughout, but it sits on top of something darker and more serious, something that gives the jokes a quality of earned release rather than simply easy laughter. Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows, from the same season, represents a completely different register. This is an episode about two lonely people, Brian, under court order to provide community service, and a shut-in named Pearl Burton, who has not left her apartment in years, finding an unexpected connection. The episode is structured as a kind of love story between two people who are each damaged in specific ways, and it allows Brian to demonstrate a capacity for genuine kindness and patience that was always part of his character, but that the show did not always find room to display. Pearl, voiced by Carrie Fisher in a performance that brought specific weight and specificity to the character, was drawn with enough depth to feel like a real person rather than simply the object of a lesson. The musical number that anchored the episode, You've Got a Lot to See, the song that would win the Emmy, was one of the best pieces of writing the show produced in its original run. The song allowed Brian to express, through the specific emotional amplification that music provides, feelings about his own experience and about Pearl's that straight dialogue could not have carried. It was funny in the specific way that honest songs about difficult things are sometimes funny, the comedy coming from the recognition of truth, rather than from the subversion of it. And it was genuinely well composed and well performed, which matters, because a song that is written for comedy but not actually good as a song undermines itself. These episodes, A Hero Sits Next Door, Brian in Love, The Thin White Line, Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows represent the specific kind of achievement that the early Family Guy was capable of when it brought everything it had to a single episode. They are not the episodes people most often cite when they are making a case for Family Guy as great television, because the moments people cite are usually the most outrageous and the most memorable cutaway gags. But these episodes are the ones that justify the show's place in the conversation about great American comedy, because they demonstrate that the people making the show understood that comedy is, at its deepest, a form that requires genuine human observation as its foundation. You cannot make these episodes if you do not care about your characters. You cannot make Brian in Love or The Thin White Line without having spent considerable creative energy on who Brian actually is, what he actually wants, what it would actually mean for him to fail in specific ways. The care that the early episodes took with their characters was not accidental. It was the result of a creator and a writing team who had decided that these fictional people mattered, that their inner lives were worth exploring, that the audience deserved comedy that was built on something real, This is the foundation that everything else was built on. Not the cutaways, those were the superstructure. The foundation was the characters and the specific way the show chose to love them. And the show that premiered on the 31st of January 1999 was built on a very solid foundation indeed. Section 22. The Road Ahead. What could have been and what was. There is a thought experiment worth pursuing in the comfortable space of late-night reflection, in the specific kind of idle wondering that belongs to the quiet hours. It is the thought experiment of what Family Guy might have been if everything had gone differently, if Fox had not shuffled the show around its schedule during its original run, if the cancellations had not happened, if the writing team from those first 3 seasons had remained together for the full run of the show, if MacFarlane had stayed as closely and continuously involved in the day-to-day creative work as he was in those early years. This is not a criticism of what the show became, or not primarily a criticism. It is a reflection on the particular quality of those early seasons, and on the road not taken, the version of this story that is visible in the best episodes of the original run, and that points toward what the show might have sustained if circumstances had been different. The original 3 seasons demonstrated that Family Guy had the capacity to be both very funny and genuinely moving, that it could deploy comedy and emotion at the same level of craft, that it could build characters who were worth caring about, and then tell stories that honored that investment. These qualities were present in every good episode of those years, and they were not small things. They were the things that separate good comedy from great comedy. Great comedy, the kind that lasts, the kind that people return to for decades, is almost always built on genuine understanding of human experience. It is built on characters who feel like people you have known, on situations that feel like things that could actually happen, on emotions that are recognizable even when the context is absurd. The comedy of recognition, of saying something true in a funny way, is deeper and more durable than the comedy of shock or novelty because it connects to something permanent in the audience, rather than something contingent and temporal. Family Guy, in its first 3 seasons, was achieving that comedy of recognition more consistently and more completely than it is usually credited with. Peter's combination of genuine love and genuine obliviousness was recognizable in the specific way of all great comic characterization, not because everyone had a father exactly like Peter, but because everyone understood the emotional logic of someone who meant well and could not stop making a mess of things. Brian's frustrated intelligence, his sense of being the only sane person in an insane world, was recognizable to anyone who had ever felt overqualified for their circumstances. Stewie's furious determination to be taken seriously, to be recognized as a formidable presence despite everything about his physical situation arguing against it, was recognizable in a different but equally universal way. If the show had been able to continue developing these recognizable qualities, to deepen these characters over additional seasons with the same care that the original run had brought to them, the result might have been something genuinely extraordinary. The Simpsons managed something close to this for about a decade before creative fatigue set in. There is no reason, in principle, why Family Guy could not have done something similar. The characters were strong enough. The creative foundation was solid enough. The audience was devoted enough. What happened instead is the story of a show whose identity was disrupted by external forces, by cancellation and revival, and the scattering of creative teams that those events cause, and then further disrupted by the internal forces that affect all long-running creative enterprises. The turnover of writers, the drift away from core character values, the replacement of storytelling by spectacle. This is not a unique story. It is the common story of any show that runs long enough. But in Family Guy's case, the contrast between what it was at the beginning and what it became is particularly sharp, because what it was at the beginning was particularly good. The episodes of seasons 1 through 3 exist as a kind of permanent record of what the show was capable of, a standard against which everything else gets measured, whether the people making the show intended it to be used that way or not. They are still there, still watchable, still demonstrating the specific magic that made 22 million people stay on their couches after the Super Bowl on a cold January night in 1999 and decide that this was worth their time. And they will be there long after the current debates about the show's quality and direction have faded into the general background noise of television history. Because the things that make those early episodes work, the genuine characters, the genuine warmth, The specific kind of comedy that comes from actually caring about the people you are making funny. These things do not age. They are as fresh in a late-night rewatch in 2026 as they were when they first aired, because they are built on human truth rather than on cultural moment. This is the real legacy of Family Guy's origins. Not the franchise, not the merchandise, not the ratings records, not even the historic Emmy nomination. The real legacy is those first 3 seasons, and the specific quality of those seasons, and the demonstration that animated comedy could be smart and warm and human and funny all at the same time, if the person making it cared enough to make it that way. Seth MacFarlane cared enough. For those 3 seasons, in a borrowed writer's room and a recording booth, and an animation production process that stretched from Los Angeles to Seoul, he made something that deserved the love it received. He made something that people carried with them for years after it aired. He made something that when it was canceled and they missed it and then had the chance to bring it back, they cared enough about to actually do the work of bringing it back. That is the measure of a thing. Not what it says about itself, not what its creator intends for it, but what people do with it, what they carry of it, what they miss when it is gone, and what they fight for when they have the chance to fight. The people who bought the DVDs and watched the Adult Swim reruns and signed the petitions and waited 3 years and then showed up in enormous numbers when the show came back, those people were answering a question about value. They were saying, this is worth something. This specific thing is worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth the effort of keeping alive. They were right. And the story of how that thing came to exist from a boy drawing Woody Woodpecker at 2 years old to a 24-year-old in a conference room with a 15-minute pilot and 4 voices living in his throat is the story we have been telling tonight. It is a good story. It deserved to be told carefully and to be heard in the specific quiet of the hours when stories are received most fully, when the day has finished its demands and the mind can finally settle into something that is just a story. Just the pleasure of following a sequence of events from beginning to middle to something that is not quite an end, because the thing we have been talking about is still going, still adding chapters, still in some sense beginning. The boy from Kent, Connecticut is still out there. The show he built is still on television. The characters he created from nothing are still recognizable to millions of people around the world. And somewhere in the warm, familiar sound of their voices, in the specific texture of life on Spooner Street, in all the accumulated episodes that have built up over more than a quarter-century of continuous production, the original thing, the warmth, the character, the love is still there if you know where to find it. It is still in those first 3 seasons. It is still in the best moments of the revival era. It is still in the episodes where someone cared enough to make it good. It is not gone. It is just waiting to be found again, the way all good things wait, with the patience of things that know they have value and do not need to announce it. Close your eyes if you want. The Griffins will still be there when you wake up. They have been there before, through all the years since January 1999, and there is every reason to believe they will continue to be there for a long time to come. Some things, built on a solid enough foundation, simply last, and this is one of them. Sleep well.